Chapter 3. The world song moves us, speaks to us. Touch the rocks, young warrior, and you will feel it vibrate the very stone. When the metal glutton comes, you will know it is time to fight for this world. Prophecies of Orluncia of Sepharil, Tablet 7, Inscription 12. Trazyn did not, on the whole, enjoy being dead, which is why, unlike the Eldari sorceress, he'd made contingencies. His consciousness rushed into the Lychguard captain's mind, overriding the native personality and banishing it to the depths of the captain's engrammatic databanks. Depending on the host, this could be a struggle, but the captain had awoken from stasis damaged and simple, an easy takeover. It was a state Trazyn preferred in his companions, to be honest, since it made them less likely to speak of what they'd witnessed. The Awakened Council knew of Trazyn's project and his galleries, but not everything he collected would meet with their approval. And they would particularly disapprove of awakening their kin early and getting them destroyed for a personal venture like this. Within a second, he reshaped the captain's malleable necrodermis, the living metal flowing and changing to take on Trazyn's familiar shape. His hood sprang up segment by segment, rising over his head as the Lychguard's death mask rearranged into his own features. A cloak grew out from his shoulders, each scale popping into existence with a little ping. When he gained vocal control, the first thing he said was, "Damn." His newly hijacked oculars told him that things were no longer running to plan. 4 Lychguard lay on the steps, sparking green, their metal flesh attempting to knit together despite horrendous wounds. The shuriken fire was a torrent now, coming from every angle. Skirmishers fired and moved in blurs so fast Trazyn could barely see their troop type. One doom scythe wobbled by, its exterior choked by pterosaurs that had hooked onto its superstructure, digging into its wires and its exposed cockpit. As he watched, one took the pilot's head in its beak and with a twist of its long neck snapped it away. The doom scythe lost control and tumbled into the rainforest like a tossed coin. It struck the plaza and ploughed through a bone god column before detonating in a superheated blast of smoke and emerald lightning. He had brought a team of only 30 Lychguard, a night scythe for transport and 2 doom scythes for aerial cover, the sort of force that would not raise any alarms among the council upon its awakening. Even for the Eldari, whose speed made them dangerous, that was generally enough. A shock assault force to secure the target or create a diversion, while Trazyn recovered the specimen. On a normal acquisition, they were on the ground for no longer than an hour, often half that. They usually withdrew, just as the locals mounted a response. But the counterattack had been almost instantaneous, as if the Eldari had detected the Necron air assets or sensed the distortion of the Night Scythe's transport wormhole. Or they foresaw me coming, Trazyn thought. Oh, cursed witches! A pterosaur, its hide painted ochre with handprints, dived into the formation and snatched up a Lychguard like a bird of prey taking a rodent. It flew the struggling warrior up into the air, its rider leaning out of the saddle almost upside down to riddle the Necron with dual shuriken pistols. Then the beast dropped him 300 cubits to the plaza flagstones. Trazyn saw more pterosaur riders incoming, a V in the sky, preparing to heel over and dive. "Fall back!" he called. "Fall back inside the temple! Defend the sanctum! Beware aerial attacks!" The force retreated in lockstep, without a glance backward to place their feet. He summoned his empathic obliterator, the long haft of the weapon starting in his palm and building itself 1 atom at a time, until it stood 8 feet tall from pointed base to the glowing jade wings of its head. Trazyn swept over his formation, doubling their marching speed, and then pointed the obliterator's inbuilt resurrection orb at the fallen Lychguard, watching as their shattered bodies glowed with arcane energies, spines snapping and joints popping as bent limbs straightened and dismembered pieces flew together as if magnetized. As the tide of Aldari surged up the steps, a Lich Guard sprang back to its feet among them, one arm still missing, its hyperphase sword carved bloody crescents in the exodites. The Aldari skirmishers fell upon him, and the other rising dead, piercing their metal bodies with knives. "That should stall them," Trazyn said, and turned back into the temple. He passed the outer sanctum of coral statuary, tramped through the rain of poison darts in the corridor, and pushed the hammer column, still locked in stasis, contemptuously aside. This time he uttered no riddle. He simply took his obliterator in both hands and brought it down on the join. Legend held that the weapon contained a relic from a long-vanished species, a talisman of power designed to break the minds and souls of lesser races. That seemed, as far as Trazyn was concerned, accurate. The great winged staff head connected with a lightning flash, and the acrid smell of disintegrated stone. An energy discharge rocked the huge gates on their hinges, blowing them backward and spreading cracks for 5 cubits down the wraithbone floor. Trazyn strode out on the causeway and saw what he'd expected. The knights in formation, already urging their slathering beasts on towards him, and the Farseer behind, her Carnosaur's footfalls shaking the chamber, roaring its defiance through teeth stained with its own blood and blacked by the fire of Trazyn's last death. As much as he hated them, they were exquisite. Burnished wraithbone helms, millions of years old, shining in the watery light of the platinum pools. Lance pennants woven from void silk, insubstantial as smoke, streaming. The terrible majesty of the mutated Carnosaur and the regality of its rider, her shoulders burdened with a cloak fashioned from the plumage of native birds. They made the causeway, bore down on him. He, in turn, held up a cube darker than the emptiness of space. Prismatic light speared out in a beam, danced on the lead rider, then spread in an arc, questing, analyzing, measuring the dimensions of each rippling muscle and strand of perfumed hair. A keening whine emanated from the box. It shook in Trazyn's mechanical grip. He triggered the lock. The charge stopped. It did not falter or pull back. It merely ceased movement. Raptors froze mid-leap. The Carnosaur's bellow was cut off. All was still, save for the void silk banners, which, due to their unusual physical properties, continued to slowly ripple in a non-existent wind. And then it was gone. All of it. Not even a scent remained. Trazyn walked through the empty air and approached the world spirit. He so disliked to run, but the shortness of time hastened his footsteps. "Do not worry," he said to the cube, which burned so cold that none but a Necron would be able to hold it. "You will not be separated from your beloved gem." Trazyn plunged a fist through the ancient Carnosaur's skull. Its brittle structure cracked and sundered under the blow. Eldari souls rushed up from the fractured calcium like embers, drifting out of whatever wraithbone had been woven around and through it. He closed his hand around the gem and pulled it free. His hand did not curl and blacken. His back teeth did not go white-hot. His bones did not crack. And he had no regrets. Until, at least, he received the security alert. Something had broken loose on Solemnes. It was easier if he focused on small things. The whirl of the cosmos was too vast, too chaotic. There was no order of operation. Like a neurocircuit full of tangled wires, it was impossible to know where each led until you took it between your fingers and followed it. Knowing where to start, that was the hard part. So he started from the beginning, when all matter lay in the same place. Orderly, satisfying. Nothing but oneness and potential energy. the last moment when the universe was truly at peace. He savoured it, aware that it was not real. Indeed, there was no guarantee the universe began this way at all. It was merely an engram simulation of a theorem, a meditative aid, authentic enough to trick his own mind into emptying so he could feel the flows of time and matter. During powerful rituals, whole solar cycles would pass with him in this state. He let it happen. An explosion. He screened out the noise and clutter, focusing on what he wanted to find. Saw it. Followed it. A single particle tumbled through the dark. Then light was born, and he saw the little mote whisked away on the eddies of the void, collecting with other particles of its type. Watched ages pass as it built from a speck to a rock to a meteorite. Watched it, haloed by flame, enter the atmosphere and bury itself in a nameless continent. Watched as a Necron extractor wraith bored the meteorite free. Necrodermis can be reused an infinite number of times. The particle was first embedded in the hip joint of a warrior, then a monolith's hull, a piece of jewelry lost and recycled. Then, yes, there it was, inside a cable in a doorway neurocircuitry panel. Ancient, faulty. Its alloy impure from the moment of creation untold ages ago, stressed from overuse, half-life draining, waiting for the moment it was fated to short. He reached out with a spectral hand and helped the moment come. Glyphs, each as tall as the intruder, lit up in 2 rows. Sigils of protection, threatening death to any that dare enter without the assent of Trazyn, overlord of Solemnes. The threat might have been more potent if the glyphs themselves were not guttering like lamp wicks in a gale, the electrical fault cascading throughout the gateway. Finally, the great slab ground backward and parted between the columns of glyphs, each massive piece separating and sliding behind the inner wall of the chamber. Trazyn had been collecting artifacts for his gallery for eons now. Not even the dead gods themselves knew how long. And while he knew his collection better than any being alive, the sprawling complex of halls and exhibition spaces was as much a labyrinth to him as it was to the intruder. Architect wraiths followed standing orders to build outward, meaning the facility sprawled in every direction, with chambers Trazyn himself had never commissioned or visited. Some proved perfect housing for new acquisitions, while others languished, forgotten for millennia. This was one such forgotten gallery. Empty and sterile, sealed directly after its creation. No construction debris marred its shining black stone floor. Not even dust settled on the empty display plinths. But before the intruder lay a group of work scarabs. They lay on their backs like stones collected together in a river, spindly legs pointing skyward to harvest ambient energy waves to power their dormant energy banks. The intruder stirred his metal fingers over the mindless drones, casting an interstitial command that awakened them from their slumber. He followed by interlocking his fingers in the hexagram of Thule, severing them from the security network. He knelt down to their level, leaning heavily on his staff. For a moment he paused to admire the aquamarine plates of their carapace. Gold filigree, set in geometric circuit patterns, inlaid in their jewelled casings. Nihilak dynasty, the intruder thought, sighing. So rich, yet so vulgar. Not even the lowest scarab escapes your garish eye. Then, leaning down to the awakened scarabs, he whispered where he wanted to go. Legs skittered on the hard surface of the floor, almost in excitement. Then the swarm departed as one, milling around the intruder and passing over his clawed feet in their haste to direct him to the proper corridor. Oricon the Diviner, master astromancer of the Sortek dynasty, architect of time, and the last seer of the Necrontyr, followed them. Trazyn stepped out of the wormhole and closed it behind him. No one else would be coming back. It had been a near-run thing. much closer than he would have liked. With the world spirit bleeding power, the panicking Eldari savages had overwhelmed the Lich Guard defending the temple's gateway and forced themselves inside. Trazyn had fled upward, climbing lizard-ribbed stairways to an upper gallery, and used his obliterator to blast a passageway through the wraith-bone dome. The Night Scythe had been waiting for him outside, hovering upside down to protect the captive wormhole on its belly. Its wings were scored to black metal by the shuriken volleys, peppering it from below, gold and green decorative dermis flaking off like rust. Trazyn got a glimpse of the Eldari temple complex, the rainforest canopy far below him, broken here and there by monoliths and bone arches, before he leapt onto the underside of the scythe, strode across its pitted skin, and dropped into the wormhole. He left the scythes with an order to return, or, if too heavily damaged, expend all ammunition, then ram a high-priority target, preferably one of the cursed carnosaurs.
Chief Archivist Overlord, Master.
Sanet, the light sculptor, Trazyn's chief curator, knelt. His 8-fingered hands splayed on the polished floor in obeisance.
Solemnes rejoices at your return.
Does it? Trazyn responded, looking around at the receiving party. It was just Sanet, accompanied by an archive wraith ready to receive the artifacts. Behind them, a hallway wide enough to refurbish a battle barge stretched empty for thousands of cubits.
I see.
Solemnes was not rejoicing. Indeed, it would not celebrate anything, by Trazyn's calculation, for 10 millennia or more. Solemnes was a dormant world, its officials, warriors and servants in the stasis death of the Great Sleep. Only Trazyn had awakened early, and he needed a mere skeleton crew to keep the world running at the standard he preferred.
A successful endeavor, my lord?
Trazyn swept a hand over the stasis caskets on the wraith's back. The jeweled boxes opened, pale wisps of blue vapor curling from their interiors. Trazyn set the gem into the larger box and closed the lid manually, ensuring it locked. He nestled the Tesseract labyrinth containing the Eldari warhost in the smaller box, giving its top a merry tap for good measure.
My lord, is this for archive or display?
Sanet conjured a stylus out of his necrodermis and held it expectantly over the Phosglyph projection tablet that hovered in his hand.
The primitive shall be displayed in the Eldari Diaspora Gallery with the rest of their kin. Between the craft welders and Drukhari displays, I assume.
The stylus danced on the light of the hologram tablet as Sanet spoke. Normally a Necron would not need such a thing, but like many who had arisen from the Great Sleep, Sanet's neural matrix had degraded over 60 million years. The deterioration had affected his short-term mnemonics. He could remember chains of code hexes yet failed to recall what had just been said. The constant note-taking, obnoxious as it was, helped with that. Auditory information would not imprint on his engrams, but the tactile experience of writing the words created a workaround. Though he could no longer serve as the cryptech he'd once been, Trazyn valued him for his skill with hard-light hologram projections, the method he had chosen to display his collection. Everyone had their damage. Of the few who'd already arisen, several of the old highborn of Necrontyr emerged not knowing their names. Others were complete automatons, or even mad. In dark moments, Trazyn feared that in 10,000 years, when the dynasties began to awaken in full, he would find all of his peers had diminished. Not he, though. Trazyn had emerged with his faculties entirely intact.
My lord?
Sanet cocked his head, the aperture of his single cyclopic eye narrowing.
Permission to repeat the question?
Huh? Oh, you may.
And what shall I do with the gem?
The gem, Trazyn mused. He folded his hands and tapped his index fingers together with a soft tink, tink, tink.
Upon reconsideration, I will handle this specimen myself.
He opened the box and scooped up the precious stone, feeling its warmth, and stowed it amongst the collection of trinkets hanging at his hip.
The determination will have to wait, pending appraisal, of course. But this may be one of the oldest objects yet collected. Meet me in the War in Heaven gallery.
Trazyn turned to go, summoning his catacomb command barge with a thought, then stopped. An interstitial message burned in the corner of his vision, the holographic phosglyphs casting a jade glow on Trazyn's death mask. Security glyphs blinked on its message seal. He opened the message, unfurling it downward like a scroll, absorbing the technical data like the calculation machine he was.
"What's this, Sanet?"
Sanet opened an identical alert.
"Exhibit breach in the Dawnwood sector. Gallery 1023. Thoth subcontinent. Coordinates 52.941472. Minus 1.174056. The Khad Burrow ecosystem,"
Trazyn snarled. He conjured a holographic image. The image was dim in colour, tinged with the green corpuscent of the chrysoprase projection, but the visuals were crisp and comprehensible. A barrel-shaped container of earth, 4,000 cubits wide and 3,000 tall, floated in suspensor fields at the centre of a vast chamber. Long-limbed creatures milled about the top, struggling from holes in its surface. Trazyn sliced at the hologram with his fingers, and it split in two like a cutaway schematic. On the inside of the earthen plug, tunnels wormed their way between vaulted worship chambers and earthen family burrows. Khrad scrambled upward, sensing their moment to escape had come. After all, they had been imprisoned inside hard-light holograms, caught like insects in amber, for at least 2 millennia. Thoughts frozen at the moment of their acquisition, with only the most astute and neurologically gifted sensing that any time had passed at all. Those races, steeped in the Empyrean, for whom the tides of the warp were part of their very make-up, tended not to fare as well. They tended to go mad. Like these Khrad, for instance, tearing each other apart with their shovel-like digging claws, spattering odd, viscous flesh on the tunnel walls. Strange arms, articulated like a spine, doubled in on themselves as they struck at each other like drovers whipping at a herd.
"Seismic activity?"
asked Trazyn. That was usually the cause.
"No reports of stasis field failure on the tectonic plates, Lord Archivist," Sanet replied. "Tesseract restart protocol and stasis containment not answering."
"Deploy the containment phalanx," Trazyn said, "with swiftness."
"And hurt the exhibits, Lord."
"They're panicking, trying to dig out," Trazyn said, pointing at the milling creatures choking the corridors. A few had split off and were tearing at the walls, trying to find the sunlight they so despised. Anything but the centuries of claustrophobic dark.
"I have at least 10,000 more Khrad in storage. But dead gods know when I'll require another intact burrow. Act now, and we can minimize tunnel and gallery collapses and repopulate the display."
Sanet's multi-jointed fingers danced over a floating glyph panel, making Trazyn recall the waving sea anemones of the World Spirit Chamber.
"Immortals, Lord?" "Indeed."
Reality cracked and sizzled among the panicking Khrad, green energy blossoms searing into being as the immortals translated to the display's surface. Khrad dropped, arms knotting and beating the ground in spontaneous seizure.
"Lesser creatures," Trazyn reflected, "so vulnerable to translation proximity."
He made a mnemonic record of the thought, factoring it into his next acquisition venture. Wasteful to harm a specimen unnecessarily. The immortals swung their double-barreled Gauss blasters up as one, and picked their first shot. Each one acquired a different target. No redundancy, no wasted effort, no need to strategize. Network combat algorithms meant every immortal knew the other's next action. They tracked their firing solutions as they waited for the order.
"Execute,"
said Trazyn, sending the impulse command even before the words left his lipless mouth. Ropey beams of energy erupted from the Gauss blasters, pulling the Khrad apart from the inside out. coiled electricity melting their flesh like hot breath dissolves frost. Viridian lightning raced from the emitter chambers of Tesla carbines, dancing through the crowded knots of alien bodies, lighting spot fires in their filthy robes where it lanced through them. Before the alien screams crescendoed, before the tangled stream of Krud could reverse their flight and take shelter in the tunnels, before even the crack of the Tesla carbines ended, the Immortals picked new targets and fired again.
"Tesla cannons stay above ground," ordered Trazyn. "Dial back Gauss blasters. Enable beam limiters to affect flesh and blood only. Any being who so much as scorches a bas-relief in the Burrow chapels gets remade into a mining scarab." "Will you supervise personally?" inquired Sanet.
Trazyn had planned to, of course, stream his consciousness down into one of the Immortals, ensure the job was done right. And yet, Trazyn had no palms to itch, no spine to tingle, no stomach to knot when he sensed a thing out of place. Yet he still possessed a subconscious. There was an irony of the Necron race that, despite all their technological mastery, the workings of their own minds remained mysterious. Trazyn's neural systems had been wrought by the transcendent star gods, whose ways were mysterious and vicious. Trazyn did not understand how it was possible, but there were still things locked away in his mind, buried, felt, rather than known. Like a sense of danger. He conjured a Phosglyph panel, split it into 5 sections, and searched through the inscription code, slowing his chronosense so that he could process libraries of data in seconds.
"Lord, fault protocol should have caught the Tesseract failure," he said. "They did, Lord Archivist, but they failed." "Obviously," he sneered, pointing. "The protocol should have been instantaneous. Instead, it took 2 microseconds. Why?" "Aging systems? Solemnes is—"
He caught Trazyn's look and trailed off, casting his monocular downward as he searched for a euphemism that would not besmirch the Overlord's beloved gallery.
"Historic?" "And the alert systems. They were unaffected by this fault, I suppose."
He looked down on his cryptek.
"This is sabotage, and not clumsy sabotage. Show me all completed door activations and curatorial assets." "Lord, odd." "Save the commentary for manuscript analysis," he snapped. "Report!" "I have a gate activation in the reserve gallery space. Several. 2 standard solar orbits ago. Encryption key matches a swarm of maintenance scarabs that are not listed as active." "Headed where?" Lights eternally burned in the War in Heaven gallery. It was the only way Trazyn could stand to come here. He was not a superstitious being. Losing one's soul, after all, tended to dampen one's fear of the mystic. And the great necropolis capital of ancient Necrontyr, filled with a blighted, death-obsessed people, was funereal long before his species had imprisoned their minds inside bodies of deathless necrodermis. Indeed, stasis crypts covered Solemnes, each of his billions of subjects nestled in a sarcophagus that sustained their cold, metal bodies. It was the same on tomb worlds across the galaxy. But just because one was dead did not mean he could not be haunted, and Trazyn entered this chamber of memory with bowed head and soft steps, even when he was not expecting an ambush. He kept to the deep shadows, reshaping the necrodermis on the bottom of his feet into a spongy wire lattice that cushioned his armoured tread. He kept focus, forcing himself not to look at the rows of plinths that surrounded him in a double line like a Pharaoh's honour guard. They were enemies. Here, an Aeldari stood mid-leap, the tip of her wraithbone dance slipper barely kissing the black display base. Next, a hulking Krork, mountainous shoulders bunched and slick with battle sweat. A Khainite warrior in green armour, crouched low, legs wide, weaving his chainsword forward and up, as if hooking it under a Lich Guard shield. A Jokero maintenance slave. And across from them, blank dummies wearing the resplendent armour of the ancient Necrontyr.
a reminder of a time when they needed armor, before their bodies were living metal. The old times, 65 million years gone. The flesh times. Their long shadows met in the center, mingling as if they still battled. Trazyn remembered the war. As chief archivist, he had attended every clash that logistics allowed, recording impressions, taking samples, attending the embalming of each great pharaoh that fell to the old ones and their twisted creations. These were old mnemonics, blurry like image plate negatives cooked by heat, burned away by the process of biotransference that had placed him in this eternal body. He could not even remember what his old body had looked like. At times, his mind reconstructed an image, or what he thought was an image, for a microsecond. The curve of long fingers gripping a stylus, dark pupils staring back from a burnished mirror. Gone. Always gone, the moment his mind's eye tried to focus on it. A self-protection protocol. What came after the flames, that was clearer. Titanic clashes, armies of metal marching with dire purpose into the faltering lines of the reptilian Old Ones. Imhotep the Stormlord, carving through the piteous Ancient Ones like the Necrontyr death god they discovered, was all too real. The dead gods, the ones he had helped murder, mouths afire as they feasted on innumerable suns. And then these Eldarian Krork, being so adept at their own particular aspect of violence. One all rage and clamour, the other grace and silence. These intrusive mnemonic routines ran in the background, passing in the span of a fingersnap as he stalked forward, primary subroutines looking for evidence of the intruder. Scry filters layered over his oculars, searching for security anomalies. He could see the stasis fields surrounding each plinth, shimmering like the air above a candle flame. Protection against seismic violence in this most precious of galleries. The bulbous, ever-flowing swell of the magnetic fields pressed upon each other, ensuring that nothing save Trazyn could pass without triggering an alarm. Then he saw the hex, and relief flooded his cold hydraulics. Because to think about this problem meant banishing thoughts of the past. 2 magnetic fields had been parted where they met, pinned back with technomantic hexes that burned with the blue-white glow of arcing electricity. Occult glyphs engraved on the very skin of reality. Trazyn was no sorcerer. He had little talent for the occult arts, and less patience. Besides, he was an overlord. He had cryptex to deal with that sort of thing. Delegation was one of the chief joys of power. Yet Trazyn knew hexwork. He could appreciate the finesse of the calligraphy and radiant strength inherent in the technoplasm. He took mnemonic image records of it for his cryptex as he ducked through the break in the field. Trazyn nearly missed the curse snare just beyond it. Would have, if he'd been anywhere else. Yet he knew every atom of this place, and noticed the void black glyphs on the ebony floor just before his foot passed their hexagonal boundary. Chronomancy, he thought. He conjured his empathic obliterator and touched its glowing tips to the border. Begone, he willed, feeling his power course into the staff. The hex snare guttered and died, snuffed out of existence, as if it had never been. Perhaps it had not, now. The relic imprisoned in the obliterator, able to warp reality at times, was a product of ancient and forgotten wizardry. Wizardry that Trazyn was eager to visit upon the form of Oricon, for only the diviner would be so bold. Trazyn found the astromancer where he least expected him. There were so many precious things in the War in Heaven gallery. Power plants of unknown manufacture, command diadems worn by the pharaohs of antiquity, an Eldari skimmer in the colours of a vanished clan, and above all those stasis displays floated a great metal conqueror worm, seeded on planets the Necron fleet bypassed to hunt their population to extinction. This gallery, the old Necrontyr gallery, was naught but mournful curiosities. Scrolls from when his kin still had eyes to read. long tar pipes, so pleasurable to those who had mouths to smoke them. A cane turned from hard wood, inlaid with ivory, its head shaped like the old hook-beaked god of wisdom. Trazyn knew the feel of that old god well. He'd spent much of his biological life leaning on that cane. And in the centre of this melancholy chamber stood Orokin, weaving hexes upon the air. Trazyn is no fool, Orokin thought. Or at least he was not a complete fool. He'd been fool enough to take such a small force down to the Exodite world, for instance. A force that was so easily besieged once Orokin warned the Primitives he was coming. A delicious irony. To pillage Trazyn's cultural treasures while he was away plundering the backwater world of some feral Eldari. But that foolishness was recent, compared to what Orokin saw around him. For it had been Trazyn's crowning folly to build this place, devoting his boundless, undying energies to a museum few of their blank-eyed kin could appreciate. Once the Necrons fully awakened, after all, how many would even be sane? Then again, the fool had proven far more resilient than Orokin's divination models had predicted. His escape from the Exodites, for instance, occurred with a speed Orokin's calculations had not considered probable. But that was Trazyn, wasn't it? Born under fortunate stars. Always the statistical outlier, never having to work for it. The bastard. It could be the place. Abnormal chronostreams threw off his powers of divination. Intrusions from the Immaterium snarled the calculations, and this planet, well, Solemnes, was a nightmare. So many objects and beings out of place, held ageless in stasis fields and tesseract vaults. 10,000 discrete timelines worth of chrono noise. He could feel it even on the edge of the sector. A great cataract on the eye of the universe. A blood clot in the time stream. Solemnes would have to fall someday, but right now it was not his main concern. But the trash data had snarled his predictions more than once during this infiltration. Orokin had even been forced to reverse his paces and sabotage the Hrad burrow to provide a distraction. Thankfully, he had all the time in the world. Hexes and zodiacs burned around him, floating in the ether, pinning back layers of magnetic fields and diverting sensor beams back to receivers, masking his presence from the environment's sniffers. All those layers of security for one inert object. Trazyn either had some inkling of what this object did, or he was the most paranoid being in the galaxy. Or perhaps the overlord of Solemnes believed that if something should be done, it should be overdone. Typical Nahir-like attitude. It had taken Orokin 3 Necron-tier solar years just to get to this point, gingerly peeling back each layer of security. Nearly there. The final stasis field shimmered a gossamer blue as Orokin wove the spell. Third finger and thumb of his left hand pressed together, marking the triangular borders of the working. Right hand dancing inside like a harpist's, painting glyphs forgotten by most in the ancient days. Hexes so forbidden that in the flesh times any who spoke them aloud would have his teeth pulled and tongue branded. Perfect. He put his fingers together, spoke the final invocation, and snapped them. The hex flared to life, dripping purple sparks where the borders held back the field. Orokin tentatively put a metal finger to the centre of the working and pushed it inward. Horns blared, gongs crashed, chamber lights snapped into the full burn of midday. Bastard! Orokin's olfactory transducers picked up the hint of Gauss flares powering up. Bastard! The beam hit him in the head, his reinforced golden headdress stripping, the beam drilling towards his precious neural spools. Orokin slowed his chronosense, ignoring the alarming heat in his cranial chamber, the way he could feel his mnemonic banks beginning to smoke. The beam drilled, slowed, stopped. Pain, or what pain Orokin felt out of usefulness, paused between throbs. The shower of sparks from his field-cutting hex dribbled and shut off, a frozen waterfall of electricity. Orokin completed the mental ritual, thought the words, and ran the chants through a verbal emitter in his wickering tail to ensure the incantation was not altered by the extreme heat engulfing his skull. The beam withdrew, his cranium rebuilding itself. Sparks flowed upward into the border of the hex. Horns and war gongs sounded in reverse, their long reverberations building to the crescendo of the first strike or blow. Hard light shut off. His hands, independent of him, wove backward, unmaking the spell. And he saw it. A Hekact glyph, insufficiently drawn. One of the staffs branching from the upper orb was unconnected, a space of 2 microns separating the spear of the line from the curve of the circle. It was what made the astromancer discipline such a difficult one. Mastery required total precision, total focus. When one used arithmancy to shape time and space, even the slightest error mattered. And with overlapping hexes this complicated, errors were easy to make. Even musing on Trazyn, though it was but a stray thought in a tertiary subroutine, had been enough to force an error. This was why he'd been living the past 20 minutes over and over again. 3 years, cumulative, to get from the first plinth to the object that lay within. Orokin took a breath. Unnecessary biologically, but critical to focus, and redrew the hex. Then he activated the working and reached inside, felt his metal hand, cold and gentle, close around the artifact and bring it out of the field. A perfect tetrahedral pyramid, shaped from living metal. Glyphs glistened on its surface, iridescent in the low light, veins of crystalline substance marbling through its structure. Puzzle box, celestial compass, key, depending on what she believed. It may be any of these things. And he believed it was much, much more.
"Ah, the Astarium Mysterios," breathed Orokin. "Interesting," replied Trazyn. "I had wondered what that was." "Archivist."
Orokin paired the greeting with a polite bow. It achieved the proper depth and angle for a greeting of equal colleagues, but remained just shallow enough to communicate contempt.
"Astromancer," said Trazyn,
returning the bow with a nod. The proper gesture for an overlord greeting guests on his own world, serving as both welcome and a warning. It was, consequently, identical to the dueling bow.
"Had you announced your arrival, I would have arranged an honor guard. A figure of your reputation should not be wandering here alone." "Kind and proper, my colleague, kind and proper."
Orokin moved sideways, insectile.
"But I would not trouble you, especially since, for a planetary overlord, you are so often away from Solemnis."
They were circling each other now, pretense dissolving. They'd long been rivals, back to the flesh times, and Trazyn had frequently imagined what it would be like to land a blow on the diviner. But Orokin's movements unnerved him. The curse of biotransference had made parodies of them all, but none more extreme than he and Orokin. While Trazyn had been remade into a hunched, hooded thing, a scholar eternally at his work, Orokin's slight frame had twisted to reflect the soul within. He was all things quick and venomous. His face and headdress recalled a hooded serpent. His curled tail, segmented black armor, and spindly limbs echoed the waste scorpions of the old capital. Divination orbs ran down his spine, swirling with cloudy energy. A single baleful ocular, mocking the foresight the cryptex claimed to possess, gleamed with haughty malice.
"Thievery is beneath you, Orokin. Hand back the trinket, and perhaps we can continue your research under supervision. After all, I, of all beings, can understand the wish to covertly acquire—" "Understand?" Orokin snapped. "To understand is not in you, Trazyn. You're a bird building a nest with shiny things.
a child with a rock collection. You want things simply to have them. Their true meaning, their use is lost on you."
"Hurtful," chided Trazyn. He dipped his obliterator so it pointed at the device in Orokin's hand. "Even if true, I see no reason why that allows you to steal my things."
"You stole it first, from the Omunos dynasty."
"The Omunos dynasty is not but inert metal now. You can't steal from the dead. That's called archaeology. The point is to memorize, learn, study what came before us. We look to the past to navigate the future."
"I prefer to look to the future to navigate the future," said Orokin. "For instance, there were 27 times I could have attacked just now, but none would have got past your guard."
"Indeed?"
"But 28 is a slaying blow."
It came faster than Trazyn thought possible. He slowed his chronosense, but it did no good. Orokin leapt to his left and conjured his star-headed staff. In Trazyn's enhanced oculars, the jagged supernova head of the weapon blurred, a chronofield boiling around it. He was speeding himself up, his weapons up, creating a pocket of reality where time moved faster than... The jagged sun cut right past his obliterator and sheared through his upper left arm with a shriek of parting metal and a gush of sparks. It buried itself in his upper ribcage and kept cutting. Trazyn felt it lodge in his central reactor. A flash. Battery acids and reactor fluid spouted in the air, flecks dotting Orokin's leering death mask where they sizzled like oil on an engine. Trazyn went down on one knee.
"Thus ended Trazyn called Infonet,"
mocked Orokin, twisting his staff deeper.
"Lord of Solemnes, keeper of trinkets, peerless in arrogance, lord of forgotten—"
And then he stopped, because the face before him was not Trazyn, but a mere Lich-Guard. The obliterator swung from behind him, catching the diviner on his segmented backplates as he twisted to evade. It connected with a flash of searing light, a brightness so pure it overwhelmed Trazyn's oculars, refracting and scattering in the lenses so the world disappeared for a moment, then snapped back, painted in prismatic rainbow hues. The blow took Orokin off his feet and sent him crashing into a display case, shorting out the stasis field and denting the plinth with his shoulder plate. Ceramic ritual urns atop the plinth, their cracks, painstakingly hardened with period-correct resin, rocked and steadied. Trazyn picked up the fallen puzzle box. "I like to keep a spare body in this gallery," he chuckled. "So much faster to stream my consciousness into it than come by barge. Translation can destabilize the stasis fields, you know." Orokin tried to rise, legs twitching. Sparks crackled from his broken spine. "So, my valued colleague," Trazyn said, "let's have a short symposium, shall we? You refer to this as the Astarium Mysterios, but surely you don't believe it's the real thing. Most likely a copy. A curiosity meant to represent the object of legend, yes?"
"You don't know what you have—"
Orokin's vocal emitters buzzed and skipped from the power overload, interrupting his crow-like voice. He pulled himself along the floor, hauling his crippled form upright so he leaned against the plinth, twitching legs trailing unnaturally to the side.
"Always a slave to the past. Even if you knew what it was, you wouldn't possess the vision to use it."
Trazyn opened his palm and cast a stasis field, pinning the diviner in place from the second vertebrae down. "Slave to the past, a lack of vision. Perhaps, my dear astromancer, perhaps." Trazyn tossed the puzzle box in the air and caught it again, delighting as Orokin's monocular widened in distress. The casualness was feigned. He'd plotted the object's arc 200 times before making the throw, and put it gingerly into his dimensional pocket. "But you are a slave to your visions, with no sense of the past.
I suppose it is our natures, yes? My lot is to preserve, yours to predict. Oh, yes, I see you do not like that word, predict. No doubt you think it clumsy. Well, I have a prediction for you, dear Orican.
He released his obliterator. It stood immobile, balanced on its pointed haft, and held a hand to his steely forehead, as if glimpsing the ethereal.
A vision of your own future.
The glassy floor rumbled as ancient tomb doors grated open. Monoliths rose around the gallery, scraping against the time-worn slabs as they ground from their stasis chambers. Inside, each stood a sarcophagus niche, shrouded with milky green fog. The vapour washed heavily towards the floor, lit from within like storm clouds as animation systems crackled to life. And, as it sank, the fog revealed crested helms. Dispersion shields and bladed weapons stood ready in inert hands. A phalanx of lich guards, eye sockets dark.
In my vision, Trazyn continued, I see you as a permanent addition to this gallery. You are, after all, a priceless antique, are you not? Orican the Diviner, seer of the Necrontyr, maker of predictions, who warned our kind against accepting the Deceiver's horrific bargain.
He chuckled, raised the Astaria Mysterios.
I think I'll put you somewhere where you can gaze on this, just out of reach, for eternity.
The worst thing about biotransference, said Orican, his voice recovering, is that in the flesh times you at least stop to breathe every once in a while.
Trazyn laughed.
I've always envied your acid tongue.
He rapped the floor twice with his obliterator's haft.
Perhaps I'll display it separately.
The Lich Guard's eyes flared as one, popping like fuses. They lowered long war scythes, snapped shields into position, and advanced. A contracting circle of metal closed on the diviner.
You call me a predictor, Trazyn, spat Orican. But mere prediction is no longer of use to me. What use are visions when the powerful refuse to heed them? You march to your doom, believing the Deceiver's promises over my auguries. Why speak truth to those that choose to be death to it?
Hyperphase blades, vibrating in and out of reality, drew closer around the diviner. Energy fields sizzled in the dry air of the hermetically sealed chamber. They were 30 steps away, then 20.
Since you all turned your back on me, my powers have grown, said Orican, and I have changed my focus.
Trazyn could see the astromancer's cranial coolants were running at triple capacity, beads of condensate plumping on his golden hood and running down to sizzle on his long skull.
Why predict the future, said Orican, when I can reshape it?
How exactly? Said Trazyn. Then to the Lich Guard, mind the artifacts.
How else do you shape the future?
Orican said, a smile in his avian voice. He fixed Trazyn with a stare.
By destroying the past.
Trazyn saw the blow just as Orican's head twitched. He threw himself forward, shouting, on an interception trajectory he knew could not succeed. There was no way to be faster than a chronomancer. Orican's head slammed backward into the plinth behind him. Metal dented and cracked. Levitator arrays shorted out. The eggshell-thin ceramics, rotating like a priceless constellation, dropped. The diviner spoke an arcane word that burst the stasis field and scrambled out of the way, hands clawing for purchase on the floor. Half-functioning feet launched him off the plinth, slamming the ground like pistons to drive himself forward, scrambling, then crawling. As he moved, his body superheated, welding damaged pieces together. Ghostly vapour twisted up from the severed vertebrae of his spine, cables seeking out each other like bloodworms sniffing for a mate. Trazyn cared not. He dived for the falling relics, slowing his chronosense to try to make a decision. It was mathematically impossible to save them all, but one he could save, one priceless example of Necrontyr ceramic work. Working angles and probabilities, he chose a bright purple jar, Sortek, 4th Dynasty, a scene of the midsummer sky above the Necrontyr homeworld, a starfield shining through the glaze of twilight. It fell directly into the cup of his hands. So focused on it was he that Trazyn could see the imprint of the potter's fingerprints beneath the bright paint. But Necron hands were not meant to handle such fine pottery. It contacted his palm and crushed inward, cracks shooting through it as if a summer lightning storm had split the sky of Trazyn's half-forgotten home world. His chronosense dialed back to its slowest. Every moment of the jar's destruction played out in individual tragedies. Around him, ceramics fell like hail, scattering painted shards as they smashed against the floor.
"Barbarian!"
Trazyn roared, his restoration protocols already running a damage analysis, matching potsherds by break pattern and sorting artistic styles as he shouted commands to the Lich Guard.
Nihilak, 12th Dynasty, kill him! Scott, 19th Dynasty, kill him! Ogdobek, 30th Dynasty, kill him!
Orokin called the fallen staff of tomorrow to his hand, as if it were a living thing. The first Lich Guard bore down on him before he could even stand. A mistake. Orokin scuttled backward like a crab, thrusting his staff at the Lich Guard's oculars. When the Tomb Guard raised his dispersion shield, the diviner scythed the staff in low, the blazing halo of its headpiece severing both legs at the ankles. As the guard fell, Orokin sprang to his feet, slamming the pointed haft of his staff into the fallen warrior's segmented throat. He shot an electrostatic discharge through the staff and overloaded the foe's neural matrix. The warrior's oculars, awakened after 60 million years of sleep, winked out. Orokin ducked, a war scythe passing a finger's span over his head. He kicked out backward, destabilizing the opponent, and broke off, dodging behind a display of gold-inlaid smoking pipes to buy himself a moment. The Lich Guard recovered and stalked towards him.
"Idiot! The ceramics!"
shouted Trazyn, hastily casting a stasis field around the ruined shards.
"Watch where you step!"
Lich Guard stalled, turned, went around. They stalked a wide perimeter outside the priceless debris field, their circular formation growing ragged, holes in the net developing as one group pressed in faster than the other. Orokin circled around the pipe display, keeping it between him and the closest guards, his back momentarily shielded by the broken ceramics.
"Surrender the mysterious, Trazyn, and this can end. You have broken all covenants, Astromancer, all rules of protocol, destroyed the last examples of our world's—"
Orokin planted his foot against the display and shoved. For a sickening instant, it creaked over like an axed tree, the racks of pipes held in impossible symmetry, until the stasis field gave out and they crashed down at the advancing Lich Guard's feet.
"Stop!"
Trazyn pleaded. The ancient pipes shattered, bowls that once held dream tar, husbanded in forgotten temple gardens, scattered broken amongst the feet of the Lich Guard, who froze mid-step, torn between the command to advance and the one that prevented them from damaging the artifacts. Orokin put his shoulder against a case of surgical instruments and heaved, grabbed a disintegrating scroll and threw it across the chamber like a streamer, completing his barrier of antiquities, his own warding circle of defacement. The Lich Guard halted, awaiting orders.
"If you wish to treat with me, scribe," sneered Orokin, "come inside."
Trazyn obliged, vaulting the debris, channeling power through to his leap, his obliterator swinging down like a great hammer. It drove down on Orokin's staff, the iron clang of their meeting echoing off the walls. For an instant, the lodestones of their weapons touched, sizzling and popping like power cables in water. Trazin shoved the diviner backward with the haft of his obliterator. Then the staffs swirled and clashed again, wheeling so fast that they left spectral fans of energy in their wake.
"Vandal!"
Trazin roared, thrusting his obliterator like a spear.
"You have destroyed objects made by craftsmen dead long before we breathed. Pieces of our past that can never be remade."
Orokin parried, rolling the blow upward and leaping sideways to avoid the downward chop that followed it.
Useless things, fetishes of a vanished past.
Trazin reversed his obliterator and slapped the staff into Orokin's side, staggering the diviner. The chronomancer backpedaled, wisps of radioactive aura twisting from the burn in his lower thorax. Trazin came on again, his fury burning. Circuits flared hot. Viscous electrofluid pumped through his systems like magma. Neither of them were warriors. For Trazin, the dust of the archive was more familiar than that of the parade ground, and Orokin had spent eons training his mind and neglecting his body. Had this duel occurred during the flesh times, it would have been comical. Two withered ancients, rangy, round-shouldered, stained with ink and smelling of incense, tearing at each other with barely the strength to bruise. But biotransference had, for all its horrors, made every Necron an armoured juggernaut. The two swung at each other, filling the gallery with the sounds of the forge. They locked weapons, shoved and bashed their plated skulls like horned beasts. The Lich-Guard looked on, impassive. They knew an aristocratic duel when they saw it, though none had seen one quite like this. Orokin broke away, whirling.
"Give me the mysterious Trazin."
"I will tear you!"
Orokin sent the Staff of Tomorrow spinning end over end across the chamber, its head burning the air so it left the after-image of a discus as it scythed into a case of antiquities.
"No!"
Trazin smashed the obliterator down, and the diviner met it with the logarithm of Sulit, conjuring a swirl of Okovoid that he wielded like a buckler. Incompatible realities clashed, the solar flare of the ancient weapon meeting the lightless ether in a backfire that extinguished the tiny portal and threw the obliterator from Trazin's grip. Such was his fury, he cared not. Trazin leapt upon the astromancer and beat him with bare fists. Each clashing blow left imprints on the living metal of Orokin's necrodermis. Orokin tried to scuttle out from under the archivist, but Trazin grabbed a string of ritual tiles and dragged him back so roughly that one tile sheared off in his grasp. Alarm gongs and trumpet klaxons filled the air. Swarms of restoration scarabs crawled down the walls like curtains, their auto-instinctual protocols calling them to preserve the scene. Trazin saw none of it. His oculars were deep focused on Orokin, fists slamming down over and over, sparks showering from each blow. The diviner laughed. Bodies as resilient as theirs could do little damage without the aid of phase weapons and flares. Yet Trazin kept hammering, beating the diviner into the floor until he felt weak. No, he was weak. Only then did he notice the diviner's questing tail wrapped around his throat, closing off his cable artery, pinching off the coolant that kept his neurals from overheating.
"Barbarian,"
Trazin said, rolling to the side, his anger spent. Orokin sprang to his feet, ready, called his staff.
"This can end, Archivist," he crowed. "Surrender the mysterious, and it will stop."
Trazin struggled to his feet, metallic dust from the pulverized floor shaking loose from his scaled cloak.
"Is it truly worth so much, Orokin?"
He spread a hand at the destruction.
"What it is worth to me is immaterial," said Orokin. "The question is, what is it worth to you? Is it worth every object in this gallery? Because I am willing to pull this chamber in upon itself, if that is what is required."
"Our heritage, our legacy."
"If it is so important, sacrifice one to save all."
Trazin wiped his hands together, a nervous habit from a time long ago. So long ago, when they were eternally stained with ink. Calculations whirled in his matrices. If/then logic problems created and discarded. If he orders the Lich Guard to advance, the artifacts become irrecoverable, and Orokin destroys the gallery. No. If he attacks Orokin, then Orokin continues this rampage. No. If he gives up the Astarium Mysterios, Trazyn slid long fingers into his dimensional pocket and withdrew the Mysterios. Such a small thing. Insignificant, really. A curiosity. A replica of a mythical object that never existed. At least, he had assumed so. Orokin clearly thought different.
"A bargain,"
said Trazyn. His voice had a tinge of desperation, so alien that he saw two of the more sentient Lich Guards exchange a glance.
"You are a chronomancer, perhaps the greatest of your kind. You can undo this destruction. It would be nothing for you."
Orokin paused, considering.
"I can? Then do it. First, hand over the device." "I am not a simpleton, Diviner."
Orokin spread his hands.
"You have me surrounded. Once restored, you may resume your interest in my, preservation. Shall I give away my one point of leverage so easily?"
Trazyn hesitated, stepped forward. Orokin withdrew a step. Trazyn placed the puzzle box on the ground, as carefully as if it were a newborn, and stepped back.
"Now your part,"
he said. Orokin's eye narrowed, and for a microsecond, Trazyn thought he detected regret in that gaze. He did not step forward to take the device.
"The difficulty, Trazyn, is that undoing the damage means traveling back in the timeline before all this occurred."
He met Trazyn's gaze.
"And if I did that, you would have no memory of this accord."
Trazyn saw the transdimensional beamer, knew what it meant. Canoptic wraiths used them to banish unwanted construction debris into extra-dimensional space, a large-scale version of the pocket dimension he kept at his own hip. Orokin's snapshot caught the Mysterios, lancing it out of existence, sending it somewhere in the great nowhere. Trazyn dived for Orokin as the diviner turned the sidearm on himself. By the time Trazyn's hands got there, nothing occupied the space but empty air. Trazyn the Infinite, archivist of the Solemnes Galleries, stood in the center of his ruined past and howled for revenge. Chapter 4. Nepereth.
"Do not mourn if I am slain. Instead, entomb me like the pharaohs of old. Not in a high ziggurat, but in a vault below flat ground, covered by sand, where no questing eye shall find my bones. Raise no stele, and carve no inscription, save one. In this tomb rests a true son of the Necrontyr, unmarked by its corruption. Open and be damned."
War in Heaven. Act 3, Scene 2, Line 1. Solemnes was famous for its galleries, sweeping reconstructions of battles, titanic heroes preserved in hard light, recreations of history's greatest moments. Even before the Great Sleep, Trazyn had entertained visitors from nearly every dynasty with his collection of wonders. What was less known was that it also contained one of the greatest document collections in the galaxy, a rival to even the Aldari's fabled Black Library. Trazyn, after all, had once been a chronicler and archivist. Though artifacts were his passion, he did not neglect the written word. It was not a project that required his close attention. He handled acquisitions, of course, for that was the most interesting part. But the rest he delegated to cryptech scribes, who catalogued, cross-referenced and digitized each work. Trazyn hoped that in another 10 millennia, when the Necron legions were destined to awaken, All of their literature, history, and discourses would be accessible, a mnemonic copy sent to the library of each tomb world. A great work for the benefit of all. Trazyn liked great works. Indeed, he had been awake far longer than even the handful of his early risen kin, and had learned quickly that lofty pursuits were an essential component to immortality. A Necron overlord's greatest enemy was not the savage orcs, the grasping humans, or the cunning Eldari. Boredom was the greatest foe, one that must be continually battled lest madness or despondency set in. So he had his gallery and his holographic archive, ready to gift once his kin arose. And besides, if all the tomb worlds had their own archives, no researchers would come to muck about in his. Nobody touching his precious manuscripts or asking obnoxious questions. Trazyn was not feeling charitable as he stalked down into the depths of Solemnes, past his restoration rooms and extensive wine cellar. He approached the carved wooden doors of the library, warm and inviting, and threw them open with a shove that stressed the hinges. His fury, though terrible, was always brief. Trazyn did not burn hot for long. His anger was cold and dry, like the desert night. A focused, lasting anger, both practical and useful. Shelves reached to the ceiling. Rotating cradles, like the side wheels of great river barges, held arcane tomes and scrolls. Cryptecs paused in their copying, stunned.
"I require assistance," he said. "Then solitude."
"Of course, my lord,"
said the chief librarian.
"Is this about the proposed expansion?"
"The what?"
The cryptech bowed, obsequious.
"The stacks are full, my lord. We are over capacity. I have humbly suggested that we expand the collection into the space currently occupied by the wine cellars."
"But then where would I put my wine, librarian?"
You do not drink wine, my lord."
"Of course I don't," Trazyn snapped. "It's far too valuable. Request denied. Enlist excavation race to dig another chamber."
"My lord."
"And bring me everything you have about the War in Heaven, Fair on Nepereth, and the Astarium Mysterious. I want the physical manuscripts."
"Quite an eclectic subject, Lord Archivist."
He called up a Foscliffe panel and ran a text scry.
"In addition to the larger works, there are many small references in various mediums that need special handling and transport. There are sheet gold scrolls, foundation stele, platinum slab tablets."
"Everything,"
Trazyn said, in a tone that did not brook dissent.
"Bring it all, then go away. I will be some time."
"Yes, sire."
"But first, bring me the legal code, the volumes on interdynastic theft and trials."
"Oh, is there to be a trial, my lord?"
"Oh, yes,"
said Trazyn, fingering the ritual tile he had ripped from Orokin's frame.
"There most certainly will be."
Mandragora, Eastern Fringe, 9 standard years later. Mandragora the Golden, Mandragora of the Emerald Skies, Mandragora, dynastic seat of the mighty Sortek. Orokin despised it, even now. Even as he'd exited the Dolmen Gate, the scars of his perilous journey fresh on his necrodermis, he could not help but release his venom.
Land of whisperers and sycophants. I should have stayed with Drukhari.
Once the third most powerful dynasty in the Necron Empire, the crown world of the Sortek was a dead place. Great sand dunes drifted against its ziggurats and palaces, burying them beneath golden cascades that mocked its grand title. Windstorms scoured its monuments with the planet's abrasive silica grains, stripping the gilded sepulchres and obelisks to their living metal interior, and giving the entire city, or what one could see of it, the appearance of brushed steel. A few districts retained their grandeur, sheltered in the lee of great stasis tombs, and spared the caustic attentions of wind-blown sand. There, statues of ancient pharaohs still stared imperious over the desert, faces distinct and spared the weathering of less fortunate monuments. There, the few hundred awakened members of the Sortek dynasty lived a pantomime existence. Accidental custodians of the silent necropolis awakened 10,000 years too early, busying themselves, taking care of a world that was largely self-sufficient, waiting for the distant day when the countless billions of sleepers would emerge. Orokin stayed well away from those districts. Before the Great Sleep, he found Mandragora oppressive. So many beings milling, clamouring, constantly interrupting. Constant politics. Petty creatures struggling for petty victories. It had been a difficult place to focus. Even achieving a basic chronotrance required shutting the world out with slab-thick walls in his astromantic observatory, perched on the humped mountain, overlooking the city, and above its sky-erasing glow. Yet maintaining a presence was necessary. Personal preferences aside, Mandragora was the Sortek power centre, and Orokin could not be a court astromancer from his hermitage on Rithcairn, more's the pity. But Mandragora had much to recommend itself in these strange days. A stable dolmen gate to access the webway, the quiet dark of a dead, sterile metropolis, and, of course, an automated defence grid that was the best in the Empire. Just the sort of thing you need if you've stolen from one of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy. Using the transdimensional beamer had been a desperate task, little better than casting lots. He'd adjusted the translocation paths to his own specifications, of course. Orokin was reckless, not dull-witted, but there had been a chance some infinitesimal variable would mar his transit. A chance that, instead of the glowing tunnels of the webway, he could have sprung back into reality in the heart of a star or floating in deep space between dimensions. Even absent those extreme cases, there was every possibility he would come out at a random point in space-time, forced to adjust and use the beamer again and again, hoping the increasingly wild translations would bring him home, and not to realities increasingly aberrant from his own. That would not have been ideal, but also not a tragedy. After all, Orokin had time. But his astromantic divinations proved true enough, and his translation landed him in a disused portion of the webway. Not the exact point he'd intended, unfortunately, but close enough. Then again, it was possible it was exactly the spot he'd meant, but that the network had changed into something unrecognizable. With the webway destabilized, it was increasingly difficult to tell. The Odari's great cataclysm had rocked the network to its foundations, snapping away arcways that used to see fleets pass and flinging them into the immaterium. Unthings from that dimension of madness increasingly stalked the corridors, and every cycle the Odari's witch-seers collapsed more pathways to keep the evils out. Orokin had wound through the coils of the labyrinth dimension, clearing passages and lurking in shadows. What remained of the old enemy's civilization was in flight. Neo-primitives, like the ones Trazyn had pillaged, migrating to new homeworlds. Vicious raiders, hunting their own, all societal bonds broken. Refugees, eyes hollow with fear, hurtling helter-skelter through the halls without regard for where they headed. Orokin did not blame them. After all, what the young race birthed had shaken him so badly he needed a century of meditation to recover, and he'd merely glimpsed it via astral precognition. The Odari's time upon the stage was ending in an era of lamentation and horror. "Fair comeuppance," he'd said, upon witnessing his first group of refugees, "for what your decadence has unleashed upon the galaxy." Slithering between the chaos, the doubling back and hiding turned a 1-month transit from Solemnes to Mandragora into a 9-year odyssey. 3 cycles alone had been spent burning his way through a wending corridor, infested with carnivorous fungoid blooms. His carapace bore new scars, talismans of an unfortunate encounter with Drukhari incubi, and his power plant needed refurbishment. But mostly, he required time for meditation and study. Now, atop his astromancer's tower, he watched the stars, sensing gravity's pull on the transit of planets, its infinite algebraic possibility influencing even the smallest events in the galaxy. The astronomers of old, stupid and superstitious as they had been, had guessed at this connection. But their pathetic spirituality had little to do with the scientific precision Oricon now used to chart the pull of gravity and the flow of particles, the bending of space-time around sucking black holes, the chain of bizarre causality that could turn a breath on one continent into a typhoon on another. And those lines of power, light, energy, and time, tended to snare around certain objects, like the one that floated, slowly turning at the centre of the observation deck. Jade shadows underlit it from the suspensor field beneath, and Foss-glyph equations and grids, written on the very air, surrounded it in a cloud. Lines traced from each theorem to the multi-sided surface of the Astrarium Mysterios. Autonomic calculators measured and remeasured each face, edge, and vertex. There were 8, 12, and 6, respectively. A perfect octahedron.
"Which is puzzling," he said aloud to the Mysterios, "because according to my engrammatic banks, you were a pyramid when I left Solemnes."
He tried to review his mnemonic data and pinpoint the exact moment of his transmutation, but it was useless. The mirrored geometry of the webway, especially since the cataclysm, fouled his recall systems into a dreamlike blur.
"You have undergone a transmutation. No surprise, as that is your function. But exactly when did you change?"
he asked, rhetorically. It was sometimes easier to think aloud, split his consciousness into a portion that stimulated questions and a portion that searched for possible answers.
What was the catalyst for this transmutation? What was the method?
Spectromantic analysis indicated a device composed of solid, living metal. The same substance that made up the tower, his staff, Oricon's own necrodermis. There were also trace amounts of mercury, an unknown crystal buried in its heart. Strange. Not standard components in Necron technology. Little wonder Trazyn, blind to the metaphysical and lacking imagination, labelled it a forgery. Even those initiated into the cryptech mysteries, if they lacked sufficient study and insight, would have thought the same. Oricon had possessed the Mysterios for a decade, and he still could not ken the basics of its operation. Perhaps it was time-dependent, gradually opening as the eons ground on, ensuring that the shorter-lived races would never access its secrets.
Conversely,
he mused, the answering part of his consciousness taking over,
it is possible contact with the webway activated it, or that it lay inert until it passed through a dolmen gate. Such a security measure would keep it from being activated outside the control of its makers.
The Amunos dynasty, dead gods curse their lifeless atoms, had been renowned for their secrecy and paranoia. In moments of frustration, Oricon took pleasure in imagining the solar flare, ionizing the neural matrices of the sleeping dynasty, shock waves scrambling their tomb world's magnetic field and rendering all systems inert. Mass neural death in the span of a few minutes. Too bad they hadn't been awake to feel it. Over the past cycle, Oricon had bombarded the Mysterios with every energy wave he considered safe, spoken to it in hex decrypt, and even tried contacting any hidden consciousness through neural transference. He'd raised 12 cryptechs, in body only, minds still at rest, and installed them kneeling around the observation deck. He networked their blank minds with his, to increase his analytic capacity and engrammatic storage, running theorems and suppositions until 2 of them overheated, blue flames bursting from their ocular sockets before they translated to the Resurrection Forge to be rebuilt. Nothing. He had called scarabs to clean up the ash piles when he noticed that one did not follow the swarm, one with a jewelled red backplate. "What?" he said, resisting the urge to crush it beneath his foot. The little drone knelt in a servile bow, shaking silently in his presence, its carapace scissored open to reveal a message or boculum. The chrysoprase projection juddered and flickered for a moment, resolving into the one being Oricon did not want to see,
Master Orokan, seer of the Sortek, the one called Diviner, said the tall being, staring into his eyes, as if she was standing in the room. I am Executioner Filius of the Triarch Praetorians, Herald of the Awakened Council. By order of the Council, you are to present yourself on Bekira, with immediate haste to face accusations brought by Trazin, Overlord of Solemnes and Archivist of the—
Oh, bastard!
Orokan muttered.
Squeal to the Council, did you?
Relating to alleged acts on Solemnes. This scarab is slave to your neural signature and will alert the Council if it detects non-compliant travel. Failure to present yourself in original body, not a surrogate, will be punished by the cancellation of your resurrection protocols. Glory to the Infinite Empire. The image winked out, and Orokan swore, for he was going on trial.
Is he coming?
The speaker, Lord Nemesor Zubakar, rested his hyperphase sword tipped down on the floor of the dais. With a hard twist, he sent it spinning like a top, the unbalanced energy blade making a sound like a faulty turbofan as it rotated in place. Each time, he caught the hilt just before it lost momentum and fell. Thwomp, 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 catch. Thwomp, 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 catch.
A summons from the Awakened Council carries full force of law, said Trazin. Orokan will come. And if it does not, Trazin thought, you will cancel his reanimation protocol, and Executioner Filius will hunt him down with that great execution scythe of hers.
Which was clearly the result she hoped for. She had been sharpening the great half-moon blade since they had converted, running a molecular smoother over the orbit of the power field, aligning the particles along the wicked edge. Nothing more dangerous than a bored killer.
Do you agree?
Zubakar asked the Ferak to his left.
I do,
replied Ferak Osuaria, her voice icy, furious as usual that a mere overlord was addressing her as an equal.
I concur,
said High Metallurgist Quelker, leaning forward from the platform's third throne.
This body holds authority in these disputes. So says the law.
Zubakar shrugged, spun the sword. Thwomp, 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 catch.
Cease that!
Snapped Osuaria, deigning to turn her head towards the Overlord, her tile diadem veil clattering.
It's interminable.
You may be a Ferak, Zubakar said, but you are a Ferak of the Raitak. I owe you no obedience.
The two locked oculars. Trazin had little doubt they were trading insults through interstitial transfer.
Please, my comrades, Quelker said, on this dais we are equals. It is the keystone of a great peace. Our body holds the empire together. We owe allegiance not to each other, but to the oaths we have taken.
The rivals broke eye contact and, as one, looked at the cryptek.
Not that you need reminding, he said,
shrinking back into his chair. Trazin swallowed a smile. Quelker was right, of course. Not that it would help his cause. Even before biotransference, Necrontyr society had been conservative and hierarchical, and those instincts held sway even in these strange times. After the War in Heaven, when the Catan star gods fought the Old Ones, with the Necrons as their imprisoned metal army, the Necrons had seen their chance to avenge the deception of biotransference. Rising up, they slew their erstwhile gods, shattering them into pieces and sealing the shards, each still powerful enough to level cities, in huge tesseract labyrinths. Yet, in destroying the Old Ones and the divine Catan, even the implacable Necrons had overtaxed themselves. It was clear the Eldari were the rising race, and would shape the galaxy's next great epoch. But the Metal Dynasties knew that no era lasts forever, and they had the advantage of deathless sleep. Already, Orokan had foreseen the fall of the Eldari and the rise of mankind, all of Necron kind sleeping 60 million years in stasis. The galaxy was a wild place, though, and even the genius of the cryptex had its limit. Occasionally faulty awakenings occurred, perhaps only affecting one sarcophagus, or at other times the tomb of a whole phalanx. It was entirely random, part of no plan, affecting everyone from the lowliest warriors of foot to those of the pharaonic rank like Osuaria, who had woken to find herself the only conscious being on her silent tomb world. Without the rigid class structure holding them in check, those awakened by fault fell to chaos. Some awakened whole Decurions without the aid of a cryptek, damaging the neural pathways of their fellows and turning them into automatons. Others took the opportunity to settle old scores, murdering rivals as they slumbered in their sarcophagi. It was the Triarch Praetorians, an order of cloistered warriors who'd eschewed sleep to watch over the stasis tombs, who finally insisted on the council. And they had given it to Phileus as their executioner, and Trazyn suspected their spy. The Awakened Council gave the Necrons a minimalist ad hoc government. They protected the sleepers under pain of death and set strict limits on the number and type of artificial risings. With premature resurrection so often leading to damage, no Necron was to be animated except under circumstances of dire necessity. But in a society where feuds were commonplace, its greatest task was to settle disputes with tribunals, like the one Orokin would, in a bare moment, be late to. Phileus tested the blade of her scythe on the edge of a metal thumb. Zubakar spun the sword. Thwomp, 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 catch. One more time. Reality shrieked and tore, lighting the death masks of the council with balefire. A rough translation, the kind conducted in a hurry.
I would prefer we make this quick,
said Orokin, green fire still licking in his body.
Let me summarize, said the diviner. I am accused of stealing an object from Overlord Trazyn and destroying old, worthless clutter.
Priceless antiquities, Trazyn corrected, holding out his wooden cane as an exhibit. The inlaid wood was snapped in two, its splintered ends already decomposing from its time out of the stasis field.
Priceless and worthless are the same thing, Orokin spat. And I remember a time when you were all too eager to give up that hobble stick. But if you must, draw up a list and we shall discuss restitution. The relative worth of these subjects, Quelker said, curbing Trazyn's response, is not for you to decide, Orokin. If you admit to this theft and vandalism of a tomb world, it is a serious offense. The law prescribes banishment or death. A law created by this body, Orokin snapped. A body whose authority in this matter I do not recognize.
Trazyn smiled. Same old Orokin, hostile to any authority, no matter how powerful. He would fist-fight the sun if he thought it was telling him what to do. It was why Trazyn had pursued this course. The diviner would build his own mausoleum, block by block. "And why is that?" inquired Osuaria. "We have held these tribunals without challenge for centuries."
"Perhaps," said Orokin, "but not with me. It is not a fair process. I am Metallurgist Quelker. Do you recall our dispute as young adepts?" "A long time ago, my colleague," he faltered. "The stars have wheeled quite a bit since then." "Osuaria," Orokin snapped, already ignoring the High Metallurgist. "My lovely Ferak, I believe you still owe me a debt for divinatory services. A substantial, uncollected debt. After all, who else could have predicted where your brother the Pharaon and his 7 heirs would be on that unfortunate day?" Osuaria stiffened. Zubakar leaned back, laughing and shaking his bulkhead-jawed head.
"Cunning my necks! You said they were lost in a void storm."
"And Lord Nemesor Zubakar,"
Orokin continued, pausing after each title.
"We've had no dealings, but the Mefrit are old enemies of the Sotek dynasty. I would not put it past you to continue that kin feud."
"I wouldn't either,"
Zubakar confessed, patting a hand on his blood-coloured chest armour. The Mefrit had never been shy about their viciousness.
Oh, come to your point,
Trazyn rumbled, darkly, then quieted as Executioner Phileas turned to him and placed a finger to her lipless mouth.
In summation, Orokin continued, no judgment you hand down will be free from the perception of bias. And given the size and stature of my dynasty, are you willing to risk the Pharaoh's displeasure when he wakes to find an unsanctioned council has executed his chief seer?
Silence. The three figures sat statue still on their onyx thrones, symbols of power that felt shakier than they had a moment before.
He would, no doubt, unleash the Storm Lord.
Orokin let that hang, then turned to Quelker.
High Metallurgist, you campaigned with Lord Imhotep on Calliope, did you not? Perhaps you could enlighten your fellow... what you call yourselves? Ah, yes, council members, about what happens when the Stormlord goes forth in his panoply of war.
Again, silence. All knew what had happened to the Khuvu dynasty at Calliope. Even now, 60 million years and several celestial wars later, gone like the Khuvu was a regular idiom in Necrontyr speech. Back when their kind still ate, it was what one said after clearing an entire plate.
It would, began Quelker, it would be prudent to remove the appearance of bias.
Perhaps we should suspend proceedings, said Osuaria, only until a suitable representative of the Sotek has arisen to oversee the proceedings on behalf of the dynasty.
It is what they would do for us,
added Zubakar, aware that the transcription scarabs would record his words, but not his disbelieving tone.
Will that serve you, Trazyn of Nihilak? It damn well won't,
Trazyn shouted, dialing back his venom when Phileas put up a hand.
It damn won't, he repeated, until a Sotek representative awakens. It's not scheduled for another 10 millennia, and this jackal son, the defendant, can control the stasis crypts on Mandragora. The Pharaoh will awaken when he wills it. As the accusatory, I cannot accept this.
Have you a solution, then?
Orokin asked.
If this body is not willing to continue, then what else is there to do but suspend it and issue a continuance?
Trazyn paused, reviewing the volumes of Necrontyr lore he'd encoded in his last decade of study. He watched Orokin smile, the diviner clearly misinterpreting his hesitation as a loss for words.
Keep smiling, Riaktalik, he thought.
If this tribunal cannot hear the case, he said, as accusatory, I assert my right to a mediator.
A what?
Orokin said.
A mediator, repeated Quelker. Yes, indeed, that is the proper procedure.
It is?
Zubakar narrowed his oculars.
When the council formed, Trazyn explained, you all voted that the legal codes of old held sway in all instances, not covered by the new codes. And I assert my ancient rights to a mediator of overlord rank or above, one that has no ties to the Sotek or the Nihilak dynasties.
The council members looked at Quelker.
It is proper, the cryptic said. It could be done. But where to find a mediator?
Asked Osuaria.
Forgive me for interjecting, Ferak, said Trazyn. This is a council world, one with dynastic representatives entombed below, and I'm sure the High Metallurgist could call upon his skills to raise one in safety, provided we came to an agreement on whom to select.
Trazyn cast a glance at Orokin, scrying his demeanour. Though the seer's death mask remained impassive, Trazyn received a glyph message via interstitial link.
Bastard!
The selection process took 2 standard years of bickering, politicking, and the occasional threat of violence. It was, in other words, a standard Necron court case. It was no accident that all dispute resolutions were, by highly practical tradition, observed by an armed executioner. More than a few cases in the ancient records ended with the phrase, Case dismissed after accusatory's dismemberment. But finally, the council made their selection.
"It has been 60 million years,"
said Overlord Voksh, his orange oculars blinking with the haze of tomb sleep. He would remember soon that he no longer needed to blink.
"Indeed, Overlord,"
said Quelker, bending over the stasis sarcophagus, which was propped up at an angle, its occupant still within.
"It would be best not to move your body overmuch, my lord. We have primarily awoken your neural matrices and vocal actuators. This will assist your re-entombment procedure afterward."
"Why?"
"We need you to adjudicate a case, my lord," the High Metallurgist explained. "After all, you were chosen to be the Charnovok representative here, were you not? I have encoded the particulars of the accusatory's writ. Do you see them?"
"Yes,"
the Overlord hissed, one slow hand gripping the narrow steel beard that jutted from his chin and rubbing it between his fingers.
"Proceed."
Trazyn stood before the onyx dais, preparing his case. It was not exactly how he'd expected this to play out, but then again, trying a case a mere 12 years after an offence was almost scandalously fast by Necron standards. The sort of frontier justice portrayed in the theatrical dramas, not how things happened in reality. Trazyn activated an oboculum, casting a projection of the Astrarium Mysterios in the centre of the chamber. It rotated in space, semi-translucent, surrounded by ocular captures of Orokin burglarizing.
12 standard years ago, Orokin, called the Diviner, seer of the Necrontyr, feloniously entered the tomb world of Solemnes in the attempt to steal this artifact, the Astrarium Mysterios. In his addled state, he believed it to be a prize worth destabilizing the peace for. I apprehended him, and in his escape he destroyed a host of precious cultural objects recovered from home soil.
Trazyn swept his hand left and right, scrolling through the chrysoprase holograms of snapped canes, shattered vessels, a pipe with a broken stem.
"These objects, how did you obtain that?"
pointed Zubakar.
"The pipe."
"Standard acquisition procedures," he evaded.
"All above board." "Go back," said Zubakar. "That pipe's Mefrit made. It should be in our gallery."
My dear Overlord," Trazyn said, "Solemnes holds all of these objects in trust for the good of all our kind."
"Damn that! It has my family sigil on it."
"If you make a formal request through the proper channels, we can certainly arrange its return," Trazyn said. He, of course, made all decisions regarding the gallery, but had always found that "we" was a magical word for deflecting blame.
"But we firmly believe that these precious relics should be in a place where experts can ensure their proper preservation and display." "This inquiry is not concerned with Overlord Trazyn's acquisition processes,"
cut in Overlord Voksh, his vocal actuators now calibrated to cancel out the sleep slur. Trazyn could see why the Overlord was known for his power as a magistrate. He had a fine orator's voice, with an undeniable sense of authority.
"You are in the right to protest the Diviner's intrusion, as well as his vandalism. It is no small thing, but I see no reason to pursue death or banishment. Restitution can be made through the re-engramming of several thousand Sotek warriors, and their transfer to your command, or the surrender of planetary dives. Indeed, that may be too radical, considering your dubious ownership. Given that, why have you escalated this petty dispute so high?"
Trazyn reconjured the projection, settling it on the puzzle box.
"This is the Astrarium Mysterios, the object of Orokin's desire." "A puzzle box?" asked Voksh.
"A mere puzzle box,"
said Orokin, before a glance from Voksh hushed him.
"A map," corrected Trazyn. "An encrypted celestial chart. In certain esoteric corners of our society, an astrarium was used to reveal the location of occult gatherings or arcane pilgrimage sites. They can be activated by a spoken key phrase or coordinates, opening when they're at a specific point on the galactic plane. Each one is individual, and each becomes inert after its successful use. I believe this one to have been already used, or even a replica. But you no longer believe that. Orokin would not have been so rash if he thought it inert.
Trazyn stared at his rival. But instead of hatred, Orokin's hooded eye was fixed on him with interest.
He suspects that it leads to a fabulous treasure. And do you have any idea where it leads?
Voksh leaned slightly forward at his casket, propping himself up on an elbow. Quelker approached him, fussing, and he waved the High Metallurgist away.
Do not make us wait. According to the encoded glyphs on its surface, Trazyn said, pausing to enhance the drama, the Astrarium Mysterious leads to the tomb of Neperef the Untouched, the last natural pharaoh of the Omunos dynasty.
There was a pause, then a barking laugh from Zubakar.
Neperef the Untouched, he mocked, from that god-awful long tragedy.
Yes, said Trazyn.
Neperef is primarily known as a character in the theatrical drama The War in Heaven, but he did exist.
Of course he existed, Ferak Osuaria sniped. It's a historical play, or history-inspired at least, but to suggest that any of it resembles what actually occurred—
You remember, do you? Inquired Trazyn. I mean, truly remember. Step forward, if you recall the days before biotransference. Can anyone tell me, with certainty, that the mnemonics contain a perfect record, with no deterioration during the aeons of sleep?
None stepped forward. The High Metallurgist shifted uncomfortably. They all knew what biotransference had done to them. Mnemonics of the flesh times were like the memories an adult has of childhood. One knows that one was a child, that one was born and lived years only through second-hand stories. Knows that there are friends, once close companions in youth, who are nothing but fleeting ghosts in memory. Sensations, disconnected from context. Things retained, but with no memory of learning them. One knows the colour blue, but cannot recall the first time one knew its name. Indeed, it was the purpose of those mawkish stage dramas to reinforce Necron history, lest they forget. It was the reason why even oafs like Zubakar knew the characters and plots inside out, despite hating their length. They had, to be clear, grown punishingly long. Now that actors could memorize thousands of pages via engrammatic recall, and the audience had no biological needs to interrupt the performance, the forgotten Cryptek playwrights who'd contributed to the drama had gone overboard. A full performance could take well over a decade.
My research has concluded that the dramas may be more accurate than previously believed, said Trazyn.
He waved towards the obuculum, summoning bas-reliefs depicting the war in heaven. Necron-tier warriors and star chariots, worn free of detail by the antiquity of the carving, advanced on the Old One's doom engines.
It appears that, indeed, Neperef was called untouched due to a genetic resistance to the radiation-induced cancers afflicting our former bodies. Further research suggests that his rebellion against the Star Gods, his doom resistance to the process of biotransference, indeed occurred.
Trazyn looked at Orokin. The diviner stared intently at the holographic bas-relief, rubbing one of the strands of tiles that fell from his shoulders. One tile was still missing, the one Trazyn had ripped from the diviner during the struggle on Solemnes. It hung at Trazyn's hip now, amidst the Aldari gemstone and other curios that dangled there, a reminder of his revenge. But Trazyn had difficulty reading the diviner's mood. Apprehension, perhaps, or merely interest. How much of this did he know?
Here, drama and history diverges, Trazyn said. In the drama, Neperef was killed attacking the Star Gods, scorched to nothing by the Burning One. But my archive contains an account that Neperef's own dynasty betrayed him, murdering Neferon and his followers to broker peace with the Star Gods and gain the gift of biotransference. Quite an anticlimax, Voksh muttered.
Indeed, said Trazyn.
But his relatives in the Amunos dynasty, despite their betrayal, apparently wished to hedge their bets. After all, they possess the only genetically uncorrupted sample of the Necrontyr species, free of disease and blight.
Trazyn swept the projection, calling up a manuscript illustration of a death procession, carrying a stasis casket into a towering gateway.
They hid the dead pharaoh in a stasis tomb complex called Cephris, hoping to return and recreate the species if they found biotransference not to their liking.
So why didn't they?
Asked Voksh.
Return, I mean.
Trazyn shrugged. Unclear. But just as we cannot remember Nepereth, his followers may have forgotten how to activate the device. Over time, they forgot even what it led to. Thus its name, the Mysterios. A mystery.
Fascinating, said Voksh. What purpose do you have for keeping this object, Trazyn?
Trazyn stopped.
He wants it for his gallery, said Orokin. To stare at it, or rather, not to stare at it. He didn't even know what he had. It was simply collect dust, a curio serving no purpose.
And what purpose would it serve for you, Oricon?
Asked Voksh. None, growled Trazyn. He doesn't believe in a return to the flesh. Oricon wants us to be, he waved his fingers in the air, energy beings, things of light. If he found Nepereth, he would likely incinerate the Pharaon to keep rival cryptex from finding a solution that was not his. Ulterior motives, my overlord.
Ulterior motives, you say? Crowed Orokin. Ask how he acquired it.
It's not your time to speak, Sandtick, snarled Trazyn.
Yes, quite right, said Voksh. But the question stands. How did you acquire this?
Legitimately.
Trazyn turned off the obuculum, packed it in his pocket dimension.
If that is all,
legitimately how?
Voksh pressed. It was part of a lot acquisition from the Amunos crown world of Hashtor. Tragic story, Hashtor. A solar flare from the local star triggered a failure cascade to its stasis system. It is a dead world, legal under salvage.
No one moved. The Amunos had been powerful, secretive and distrusted, but their absence would be a blow.
The Amunos dynasty,
Trazyn paused, looking around the room to let the message sink in,
will not come to claim it.
The council and executioner stood, stunned at the dire pronouncement. Voksh murmured in the back of his throat.
That appears to be legal under salvage.
Ah,
goaded Orokin.
But when did you acquire it?
He took a step forward, tile strands rattling against his skeletal body.
I have not yielded the floor, said Trazyn.
Did you steal the Mysterios before the Amunos died out, or after? Because, by my auguries, you raided their vault for artifacts well before the solar flare. In fact, immediately when it became clear the solar flare would snuff them out.
Your information, Trazyn said, with a hint of frost, is incorrect and out of procedure.
Wait,
said Voksh.
Are you alleging that Overlord Trazyn, aware of the solar flare, did not alert the Tomb World's deep spirit and instead raided it for artifacts?
Just so, said Orokin. As you heard him say, the Amunos dynasty will not come to claim it. A perfect theft. He walks away with the goods, and the cosmos wipes out the victim. No one can complain.
That is ridiculous, Trazyn said.
Villain, crowed Orokin.
Plotter, traitor to your own kind.
Is it true?
Demanded Voksh.
Keep in mind my vocal scries are on high alert. Any lie will be detected.
Well,
Trazyn tutted in frustration.
Understand there was very little time to make a decision.
A groan went up from the council.
No, listen, he stumbled. Awakening a tomb world takes time, at least a half-century, even under optimal conditions. To save even the higher orders would have taken more time than was available. So I focused on salvaging what I could from the material culture. Murderer! Snarled Ferak Osuaria. It is you who should be on trial, Trazyn, not I, sang the diviner. I foresaw your treachery, and— Wait! Trazyn motioned for quiet. You foresaw it? Of course! I foresaw the horror of biotransference, the fall of the Eldari. I have seen the coming of hungry creatures you cannot fathom, and— If you saw the solar flare, asked Trazyn, why did you not stop it? Did you hope to sweep in afterward and take the Astrarium without resistance? Orokin stared, frozen. His mouth worked, giving a metallic clunk. Clunk, clunk. You misunderstood me, I think. Executioner, said Vox. Take them both. Bastards, muttered Orokin, fingering his ritual tiles. I knew Vox was a bad idea. The Amunos dynasty, Trazyn paused, looking around the room to let the message sink in, will not come to claim it. The council and executioner stood, stunned at the dire pronouncement. Sad news, said the adjudicator from her stasis casket. She raised her head, the resurrection orbs that hung from her headdress tinkling like a chandelier. I assume you are claiming salvage rights. Trazyn breathed a sigh of relief, or at least the closest he could get to one without lungs. He had worried that Supreme Excellent Lady Yulin was not the right one to conduct this trial. He feared a lighter touch might let Orokin run wild, yet he had been relatively subdued. And yet Trazyn felt displaced. A feeling he could not access perturbed him. Reactor coolant sloshed about his innards, as if he'd experienced a hard translation. He felt a strange heat by his hip, and noticed the ritual tile which hung there, the one he'd taken from Orokin, was warm. Odd. Overlord Trazyn, asked Supreme Excellent Lady Yulin, do you wish to claim salvage rights? Yes, indeed I do, Overlord. Supreme Lady, Adjudicator. Are you well, Trazyn? The Supreme Excellent Lady's oculars folded in concern. If the venerable Trazyn is done, cut in Orokin, I have evidence to present. Please do, nodded Yulin. Overlord, please sit down. Clearly, what you witnessed on Hashtor has affected you deeply. If you have more evidence to present, you may do so after you have recovered. That did not seem like the worst idea, Trazyn thought. His head felt clogged. His central reactor cycled at a dangerous rate, and that sense of unreality refused to abate. He locked his legs and took the weight of his frame. A seat without a chair. My lady, said Orokin, as you see, Lord Trazyn, a dear friend for many centuries, is having difficulties. Biotransference and the Great Sleep have taken a toll on all of us, I fear. This is but a misunderstanding. Trazyn stopped, turned his head. Misunderstanding? Oh, poor Trazyn. He invited me to conduct research on Solemnes. You see— Orokin opened a dimensional pocket and withdrew the Astrarium Mysterios. I also have a device. We were comparing them. Trazyn's eyes found the device and locked there. His sense of being in two places, his void-sick feeling, stopped, as if the Astrarium Mysterios anchored him. Partway through our symposium, he became confused. Oh, poor being. He accused me of stealing his device, even set his lich guard on me. Trazyn reached out a hand, bombarded the Astrarium with his spectrometer, received the results. Of course, I had to defend myself. He's transmuted it! Roared Trazyn. You've solved the first puzzle. He leapt up from his crouch, bending towards the device. Orokin shrank back,
and the executioner reached for Trazyn, but he leapt away, opening his projection, adding his spectromantic data. "The composition is exactly the same. See? The exact same!" Trazyn snarled as the two component reports joined into one, signalling a 100% match. "He's lying to you!" All heads turned towards Orokin. He tapped a finger on the astrarium, calculating his next move. "Oh, hell," he said. "The Amonos dynasty," Trazyn paused to let the message sink in, "will not come to claim it." The council and executioner stood, stunned at the dire pronouncement.
"But that alone does not confirm your salvage rights, does it?"
said Overlord Baalbek, his voice resonating inside the stasis casket. He raised his head, the golden sketches of waterflowers engraved on his death mask catching the wan light.
"We cannot simply claim anything we find. It is lawless, and there may be other interested parties."
"What?" said Trazyn, fighting the void-sick feeling in his internals. The blackstone floor rocked, like a command barge, needing an attitude calibration. He tasted radiation coolant in his mouth. An interstitial alert, overheating on his right hip. Trazyn looked down to find Orokin's tile glowing white-hot, hissing where it had contacted the cold metal of his hip.
"If I may, Overlord,"
said Orokin, stepping into the center.
"from my understanding, the Astrarium Mysterios is exempt from the laws of salvage. It is part of the common heritage owned by all Necron kind."
Overlord Baalbek nodded.
"As I said, other interested parties."
"Indeed,"
Orokin continued.
"Lord Trazyn has argued quite convincingly that this tomb, should it be found, would be not only a treasure of history, but also a path forward for our kind."
Trazyn stared at the burning tile. It nagged at him. He'd seen it before. Images flashed in his mnemonic banks, lighting up his neural cavity with flashes that came and went like sparks from an overloaded power relay. A headdress, power orbs hanging from it like a chandelier. The deep voice of a courtroom orator. He put a hand to his aching cranium. The tile burned through its smoking cord and dropped to the floor.
"After all," said Orokin, "why should the Nihilek control this incredible find? Whoever takes the Astrarium Mysterious should have a chance to seize this once-in-eternity opportunity for power."
Trazyn felt the illness recede. It was as if the ornament had been pulling him apart, and, as it smouldered on the floor, he heard the shouts of assent and excitement from the council members. Partisans. Every one of them, thought Trazyn. They might claim that they fight for Necrontyr, for the Infinite Empire, or their own kind, but it was a lie. They wanted power, for their pharaons, for themselves. Osuaria murdered her brother and nephews. Zubakar could not feel powerful without conquest. Even the meek high metallurgist Quelker had betrayed friends on the way to his position. Graspers, all of them. And all of them, the fools, thought they could beat Orokin to the tomb. They saw him as an eccentric, half-mad astrologer. But he was so much more dangerous than that. And Baalbek, so rabidly loyal to his own dynasty, was the most mercenary. Baalbek, whom Trazyn had backed as adjudicator simply because Orokin had protested so greatly when the council proposed him. All at once, Trazyn realized he had been tricked. Orokin had wanted that bias, counted on it working in his favor.
"Very well," said Baalbek. "The Astrarium Mysterious will be owned by all and none. A free object belonging to he who possesses it. Stealing it shall be no crime, killing for it no sin. And whoever opens the crypt may keep its contents for the greater glory of their dynasty."
Orokin looked at him, grinning, and in his core, Trazyn knew the chronomancer had bested him. The ritual tile swinging from his shoulders radiated heat so bright it reflected off his long steel bones. And with his mind clearing, Trazyn realized what the chronomancer had done.
"So, it's war, Diviner," he sent over interstitial message.
"If you can catch me, Arcovist."
Chapter 5. Kepr's Proof.
An adept shall not attempt this hex until they have mastered the 9th book of conduction, and successfully channel powers of up to 77.777 Keph. If so, disjoint the 2nd and 3rd fingers of the right hand at the knuckle, bending them together to form a diamond to concentrate the energy. Of the 2 outside fingers, snap them backward at the knuckle like eagle's wings to collect the ambient currents. Once captured, the thumb may be thrust forward, like the antenna on a dish, to direct the energy discharge.
Currents of Ruin, Folio 6, Canto 3. Mandragora, 9,984 years before the Great Awakening. Orange. After 6 centuries, Orokin was sick of orange. It tinted everything in his astromantic observatory, from the black stone floor to the ferroconductive astrolabes, to the dead oculars of the cryptex, now 20 in number, that knelt around the Astrarium Mysterios in concentric layers of octagons. Their repetitive chanting of the 88 theorems buzzed in Orokin's auditory transducers, filtered out so it didn't drive him insane. But the orange light and repetitive chants, much as they annoyed him, were necessary. Zatoth's harmonious sphere was a difficult conduction to sustain, especially as a subroutine. It would have taken most of Orokin's neural function to bring it into being, leaving him incapable of analysis. And the orange light it cast, visible no matter the spectrum, was a small nuisance considering it let him conduct his rituals outside the flow of time. For every century that passed outside the chronostatic field, 3 inched by within. Orokin possessed limitless patience for study, lost himself in it. Let the pursuit define him, become nothing but programming and thought that worked the problem. He floated on a suspensor field, fingers positioned in the open eye of Sut, perception suite dialed back. Soon, the canoptic wraiths and scarab swarms, ordered to replace fluids and cool reactors every 6.4 years standard, would move in the background as unreal blurs. He surrendered his physical self, allowed his consciousness protocols to slip so his astral algorithm could go forth from his metal frame. Many Necrons could transfer their consciousness. Even the meanest overlord could scry part of his mind through the ocular systems of his warriors and scarabs, seeing what they saw. Trazyn, dead gods burn him, could even transfer his consciousness into new surrogate bodies. Orokin would give 10 worlds to know how the Archivist did that, though he suspected it involved some mean alien artifact, rather than personal study. Trazyn was a bore, a clumsy meddler, a mere Orokin refocused. Projection required serenity, a mind clear of the looping subroutines of obsession and anger. Anger, that was his stumbling block. Always there, anger, a spiteful shadow following him to the astral plane. Even when he projected, it tied him to his body. He might lessen it, feel it grow weaker, but fury always stretched out behind him, an umbilical cable tying him to his physical self. He touched it with his astral fingers, lightly, to get a read on its strength.
They should have listened. Bastards! They never—
About normal, then. He was feeling good after his victory over Trazyn. How he'd fooled that hunching sack of mnemonics, calling himself an overlord. What was an overlord to Orokin? A being wrapped in the pursuits of the present, heedless of the future. The anger again. He released, felt himself sink deeper in the autonomic trance. Not always a bad thing, that anger. In some of his most clandestine experiments, hidden from the eyes of the other Cryptek masters, it had even saved him, snapped him back to his constructed body when the tides of the cosmos threatened to sweep his astral algorithm out into the vast blackness. A spark whirling up from the fire of existence. Another molecule pressed between the whirring gears of the planets, resigned to the pull of gravitational fields, drifting with the dust of meteor belts and rolling along the curve of space. The chronostatic field helped with that, kept him from diffusing, maintained focus. Focus. Surrender. Relax. Sink deeper. Listen to the droning metronome of your power plant. Listen to the droning metronome of your power. Listen to the droning metronome. Listen to the droning. Listen. Orokin feels it happen. No, not feels. Knows. He moves beyond feeling as his essence slips out of his chill body and into the soft womb of the chronostatic field. Floating free, he looks back at his solid form, still floating on the suspensor field. Head back, closed ocular pointing skyward at the stars that glint through the invisible defense field. Stars, worlds and fields of space dust, smearing technicolor across the dark sky. It has taken 6 years to achieve this state, and now the work begins. 1st century. The first 100 years pass in deep study. Orokin drifts through his etheric library, heedless of time and physical constraint, disappears into the texts, lives between lines of glyphs as if they are rivers running by him, babbling out their knowledge as they pass. His consciousness alters, as any consciousness does after consuming new knowledge. Learning from long-dead teachers, he is no longer the Orokin who sits floating on Mandragora. The astral Orokin knows, with some melancholy, that this cannot last. That once uploaded back into the body, its systems will reassert themselves, and his older personality will return. He will retain the key knowledge, but much will be lost. Letting that go, he gusts into the works of Numinios, studying his Sephiric script in ways a being of metal could not. These are esoteric works, indecipherable to those enclosed in the physical. Orokin rearranges the glyphs, reading them forward, in reverse, drifting through them to see the encoded backsides. Numinius was a master of transfiguration, able to rework molecules as easily as he'd encoded the secrets in his uncollected works. Line by line, with a tedium that would frustrate a mortal consciousness, Orokin decrypts the tangled code. 90 years of study. Only a small victory. Orokin discerns a theory on the theoretical function of the device, a better understanding of the molecule chains in the metal. According to Numinios, molecules formed at a certain resonance can be tied to celestial bodies, keyed to a certain gravitational signature. Sensing the overlap and alignment of directional pull, they can change depending on their location in the cosmos. Trazyn said, Orokin remembers, that certain astrariums opened due to location, and this state change had occurred as he passed through the webway. Could it be, he thinks, that this location was in the labyrinth dimension? Did I trigger a state change by pure chance? Finally, something to test. Running a gravitational hex through the networked minds of the Crypteks, he aims a gravitational projector at the astrarium, its cradle encircling the puzzle box with graviton rays. He retrieves the logs from his body's onboard gravitometer, running through the fields he'd passed through on his transit through the webway. 647 field configurations. Orokin sets the graviton ray positions to the first field configuration and fires. The Cryptek's chanting falters. Orange fire blazes behind their oculars. Graviton beams, bright violet in his astral vision, spill and ripple over the octahedron surface. Nothing. He moves to configuration 2 and fires. On configuration 417, he sees one angle split. It opens like a mouth, revealing a shine of liquid emerald inside the throat of the astrarium, then snaps tight. Close. Nearly there. 418 does it. Without sound, but radiating extreme heat, the astrarium begins to change. Its sharp edges fold outward, turning inside out. Angles disappear, faces fold in on themselves, moving in a way matter should not, grinding, as if it is working against purpose to regress. The octahedron becomes a pyramid once more. It vibrates in the field. The cryptek screams, his mouth smoking. To Oricon's dampened perception suite, it is no more than a loud breath. Another joins the chorus. Like the pop of firecrackers, one networked neural system fails, then another. They shriek with a pain they should not feel. Oricon shuts the gravitometer down. Cryptek heads fall forward, insensate on steel ribcages. The astrarium is an octahedron once more, wisps of neon smoke twisting from the glyphs in its surface. For a bare moment, it projects a name in the smoking air above the device. Vashani. And a clock. 264 years, 16 hours, 4 seconds. 3 seconds. 2. 1. Apparently, time is no longer on his side. 2nd century. The trace mercury atoms, the crystal buried deep inside the astrarium. Oricon curses himself for his narrowness of thought, rages at his own leisurely sloth until the spite threatens to yank him back into his rigid body. Mercury ions. Crystal. Those elements mean only one thing. A mercury ion trap. A time-keeping device. Buried inside the astrarium Mysterios, silently counting the seconds, is an atomic clock. It will open again in barely over 2.5 centuries. Whatever he'd done to it in the webway, whether intended or not, had started a countdown. But the gravitational transmutation suggests that it won't simply open at the appointed time. It has to be in an appointed place. Indeed, it is possible, even likely, that his transit through the webway had unknowingly brought the Mysterios close enough to its first keyed location that it had transmuted, even in the dimensional pocket where he carried it. Which is impossible. But then again, it is also impossible that outside gravity affects the webway at all. With this knowledge, Oricon casts his consciousness backward in time, to the beginning of his research. After all, he is a slave of the hourglass now, forced to conduct work under the device's own countdown. If he can make up a century... Only he finds it still counting down, not with more time, but less. He quickly reverses himself, shooting his consciousness back to the present. The Mysterios, it seems, has been proofed against chronomancy. An alert interrupts his studies. Automatic defenses detect an incoming meteorite, but spectromantic analysis indicates the object contains living metal. It notifies him of a firing solution. "Greetings, Trazyn," Oricon thinks, "and farewell." He does nothing, merely watches the defense grid blink to active, then broadcasts that the foreign object has been destroyed. Oricon goes back to his studies, looks up to see another alert, noticing that 13 months have passed since the meteorite was destroyed. This time, it's a meteorite shower, at least 30 objects hurtling towards the atmosphere. Clearly, the old archivist is trying to run the gauntlet, zip from surrogate to surrogate. Good luck to him. Automated defenses count down the number of remaining meteorites from 30 to 15 to 2. The surface of the chronostatic sphere ripples like a disturbed pond as the backwash of Mandragora's air defense grid lets loose. Doomsday cannons and death rays lance the reality outside. If mortals had been there, their lungs would have cooked breathing the superheated air. All targets destroyed. Orican dismisses the notice and runs a last decrypt equation on a minor work of Talclus, a rather pedestrian treatise on gridded cryptomantic equations, but necessary background reading nonetheless. Satisfied at his preparations, he turns to the main object of his research phase, the Vishanic manuscripts. They are gibberish, lines of trash glyphs without form or reason, unreadable and obscure, a legend among initiates of the cryptech mysteries. Rumour has it they hold a great secret, but if that is true, Vishani had guarded it well. She had been mistress of secrets and high cryptomancer to the Amunos, the greatest occult encoder of her age. The Vishanic manuscripts are not difficult because of their encryptions alone. It is their layers of encryption. Only 6 cryptechs, including Orican, have ever decrypted the text. All of their decryptions were different, and all of them were wrong. 2 rendered a list of Amunos tomb worlds. 3 decryptions formed a history of the Amunos dynasty, from 3 different narrators. Orican's solution, maddeningly, had rendered construction schematics for an impossible ziggurat, one whose structure obeyed only its own warped conception of physics. Load-bearing pillars, thin as thread, heavy materials stacked upon fragile ones, almost a parody of a building. Ages ago, Orican had even built a scale model in holographic chrysoprase, hoping a geomantic analysis of its angles might lead to an algebraic key. It had not. Vishani was not brilliant because she'd hidden the solution to her manuscript. She was brilliant because she'd encoded many solutions into the text. Indeed, there were masters of the cryptech mysteries who believed the whole thing a joke, a prank to bedevil and occupy rival dynasties, who hoped to learn the secrets of her pharaoh. If it was, she'd miscalculated. Rumour was that during the War in Heaven, a rival cryptech had imprisoned and tortured her to death in search of the answer. The tale went that she promised to tell him. Then, when he leaned close to hear her answer, she'd overloaded her reactor, incinerating them both. Orican admired the sheer spitefulness of it. But why, he thinks, go through all that for a prank? Especially when one of the 6 translations, the second of the dynastic histories, was the only one to mention Nepereth the Untouched. If the stories are true, if Nepereth lies hidden, it would have been Vishani that spirited him away. And Orican has no doubt the Astrarium Mysterios is her work. It is too clever, too maddening to have been made by another. Orican works in a white heat, long obsessed with the Vishanic manuscripts, and Orican is, if anything, a being of obsession. He devours the text for hidden meanings. It is as if he's never read this text before, and 9 years into the scouring, he realizes he has not. Previously, when he'd studied the Vishanic manuscripts, it had been the hard copy kept in the library of his order, supposedly a direct copy of the one on the Amunos crown world of Hashtor, though there had always been doubts about that, given the secretive nature of the Amunos. It would be just like them to disseminate flawed texts. Indeed, when Orican had travelled to Amunos to salvage what he could, he had hoped to recover an original copy of the manuscripts. To his eternal horror, Trazyn had got there first. Orican had been forced to acquire a data copy from their etheric library. Yet, as he reads, Orican increasingly notices differences. Word orders switched here or there, variant spellings, formatting differences. He reviews the Amunos copy side by side with his own data copy. They are not the same. Vishani was a data sorceress, an encoder the likes of which the cryptech mystics would never see again, floating in the ether, surrounded by code. With a flush of discovery, Orican realizes he's grasped the revelation, the reason why no one could find another layer of encoding in those 6 decryptions. The data copy is the master document. The hard copies they'd worked on for millennia are diversions. The 6 decryptions were only the first layer of the riddle. And this decryption of the Amunos history is so much more than he'd known. Nepereth was not known as the Untouched simply because his physical form was resistant to the tumours. He was also unmarked in battle, in duels, because he was a projectionist, able through technology and personal focus to cast his mind onto the battlefield as a thought form, a being of energy far more powerful than the poor astral algorithm Orokin has cast. One that did not require a chronostatic field or years of trance preparation.
Think of it, Orokin muses. The children sitting on the council hoot and cheer over the prospect of returning to the flesh. We could be so much more, beings of light and power, the eternal lives of the Necron wedded to the souls of the Necrontyr. Why return to the ravages of mortality when we could become beings of the ether?
Orokin dives into the esoteric treatise of Vishani, works feverishly, staying rooted, overlaying the countdown on his vision so he remembers the object of his searching. Year after year, Orokin's awe grows. Vishani had been a rare genius. Indeed, were she still operational, Orokin's competitive nature would force him to despise her. Rivalry runs deep among cryptech masters, and he has enough self-knowledge to understand that he is prone to knowledge jealousy. Yet, the dead are no rivals, and he is free to admire the mistress of secrets for what she had been. At least, before she had died so badly. He spends 80 years meditating over her algebraic poetry, floats free through her astromantic maps, admiring the fine detail work of her chrysoprase projections, devours her treatise on the importance of following an order of operations while casting multi-layered quantum shields. At the last, Orokin finds himself shocked speechless that such obvious innovations, the use of a logarithmic spiral in overlapping fields, have not occurred to him. The mistress of secrets had been a polymath of unusual talent and singular vision, if a few eccentricities. The logarithmic spiral, for instance. Its shape appears in her chrysoprase reconstructions of the cosmos, whirling galaxies and sucking black holes, making the pattern, when in reality they would be far more wild, and as a motif in her collections of algebraic poetry. And it is mentioned 6 times in the Vishanic manuscripts themselves. Wait. Orokin summons the manuscripts, enters the patterns to access the Nepereth decryption, lays the glyph text out on a 2-dimensional grid, rearranges it via the meter Vishani favoured in her algebraic poetry, and then, astral hand trembling, he sweeps his palm in a circle, stirring the floating glyphs, chanting the equation for a perfect logarithmic spiral. Glyphs drift and turn, fold and shift, take new places in a spiral labyrinth of pure equations that slowly wheels in front of his disbelieving ocular. Motes of useless data drip from the wheeling arithmetic thought form, like embers falling from a torch. "Here rests a Theron like no other," one of the kneeling cryptecs murmurs.
"Behold, the tomb that holds the one who will end the age of metal,"
another drones.
"He lies within,"
another answers.
"His incorporeal form lies with eyes open. Nepereth! Nepereth! Nepereth!"
They take up the chant, not a droning rote repetition like the 88 theorems, but an ecstatic ululation steeped in passion and trance joy. Orokin looks around, sees blue light blazing from the eyes of his sleeping cryptecs. Glowing fluid leaks from their oculars and mouths, patters on the black stone floor.
"Nepereth! Nepereth! Nepereth!"
With a chill, Orokin realizes his empty body has joined the chorus. The wheel of radiant, arithmetic glyphs drifts towards the Mysterios, mates with it as if the octahedron were the natural center of its axis. As they meet, the spiral spins faster and faster, quick as a chariot wheel at first, then rotating with the cutting speed of a circular saw. Glyphs on the Mysterios pulse with internal power. Beams of energy spear out of every symbol and angle, filling the observation deck with a projection that burns with an astral intensity that Orikan cannot look directly at. But he knows what it is. A star map. Trazyn was known throughout the dynasties for many things. Giving up was not one of them. Even before the transition to metal, his fellows considered him notoriously dogged, even stubborn in his pursuits. But immortality had made him relentless, granting a patience that his frail body of flesh could not tolerate. Trazyn was not, in other terms, a coward. His power plant held nothing but scorn for those who deserted an endeavour. But he was willing to admit it when he needed to change his approach. Mandragora, for instance. He had exhausted his options on that score. After his endeavour with the meteor shower, a plan that resulted in a rather unpleasant number of disintegrations, he'd abandoned orbital entry. It was certainly true that the Sortek were jumped-up warmongers with no sense of culture. A middling dynasty at best, coasting on the strength of a few competent generals. And without doubt, they were far too arrogant for Trazyn's liking. But they certainly knew how to build an air defence grid. Sneaking in via the Dolmen Gate proved similarly fruitless. 5 steps past the arch took him into a pack of rather unfriendly canoptic spiders. To ensure he hadn't just been unlucky, he tried twice more, before realizing the swarm lurked around the gate on an endless patrol. After roughly a century, he'd taken stock, stepped back, and considered his options. He'd become too consumed with the puzzle of breaking Mandragora's defences, and forgotten that the Astrarium Mysterios was a means to an end, not the goal in itself. Become, in essence, the short-sighted buffoon Orikan accused him of being. Because even more than quitters, Trazyn loathed those who lacked imagination. Which is why he'd gathered his cryptex in the Archives reading room, the closest thing to an audience chamber he possessed. They stood around a chest-high table, its sides carved in a turquoise and gold bas-relief depicting the departure of the Silent King. Their tireless legs made chairs unnecessary.
"Start with this,"
said Trazyn, tapping one finger on the tile he collected off Orikan.
"What is its composition?"
Sanet paused, his stylus hovering over his Phosglyph tablet.
There are limits to what I can say, my lord. Certain mysteries of the cryptic order are inviolate. The punishment for revealing them are quite—
"Sanet," Trazyn interrupted, "you have been to my gallery, yes?"
I have.
Then you know that I possess every conceivable apparatus of violence. I believe you asked to be excused from cataloguing the Drukhari gallery, correct?
Sanet said nothing.
"To wit, if you truly believe the cryptic masters can devise a punishment more horrid than even the most casual selection out of my gallery, I'm willing to prove you mistaken."
It's a time trial,
Sanet blurted.
When we achieve a certain mastery in a school, we carry tokens of our achievement. The higher the mastery, the longer the chain of tiles.
"Obviously," Trazyn tilted his head. "I am not unfamiliar with the structure of your little cult, Sanet."
But they are not merely symbolic,
the cryptech added, pushing his stylus away from him, as if worried he might spontaneously transcribe his own betrayal.
They are essence totems, forged from whatever substance our school studies. Kybor, over there, is a Voidmancer, and his tiles are the distilled substance of the gulf between stars. I am, or rather was, a dimensionalist.
He reverently held up the trail of shimmering purple tiles that swayed from his shoulder.
These are the blood of the universe, harvested from the wounds created when we tear open dimensional gateways and emblematic of—
"And this, I assume," said Trazyn, peering at the tile, "is time?"
"Correct, my lord. pure space-time. When we cast our hexes, the power resonates with these totems.
Would it still react with its fellows were it in the same room? For example, if I stole one of Kyber's totems and he channeled a black hole, would the tile heat?
Oh, indeed, said Kyber. The ambient energy of the hex would react with the tile, even if it was not one of mine. It is why cryptex join together in conclaves during battle. The resonance can produce much more powerful hexes, but if it was paired with its fellows, it would certainly demonstrate a strong kingship.
So, if Orokin used chronomancy while I held this totem, it would become hot?
Warm, corrected the Voidmancer Kybor. To become hot, he would need to have been altering the timeline multiple times, and likely the one holding it would experience ill effects, mismatched memories, extreme discomfort.
So you're positing he went back more than once? Trazyn asked.
You misunderstand, my lord,
Kyber said it gently.
Chronological manipulation on that scale would not be possible, beyond even the highest practitioners of their school. One trip back takes a great deal of focus and energy. 2 at most, 3
would be needed to make the totem this hot. Trazyn projected a temperature reading saved from his engram banks. He is capable, my faithful ones. More capable than anyone expected. Talented enough to foil the Council's verdict not one time, but at least 3 that I can partially recall. He summoned a projection of the puzzle box. And now he has the Mysterious and the crown world of Mandragora.
I have drawn up new formulations for a Mandragora assault,
said Trazyn's tactical cryptech, Teknev.
It is well fortified, as your reconnaissance discovered.
An artful euphemism for repeated atomization, Teknev, Trazyn smiled. You shall go far. Teknev ignored the compliment.
There are no options below a Legion-level deployment.
Prepare strike packages, said Trazyn. Have the option ready. But I want possibilities beyond direct assault. The Mysterious is merely a map, a means to an end. When Orokin does conclude his research, he'll need to come out of his hole to claim the prize. So, how do we find out where he's headed? And how can I counteract his chronomancy once I catch him? No one spoke for some time, the whole table working on the problem in quiet cogitation.
There are,
said Sanet, then stopped to clear his vocal actuators, which had frozen up in the 3-year silence.
There are 2 artifacts that might assist you.
Artifacts, said Trazyn, skepticism echoing in his vocals. I have searched the catalogue 6 times. There's nothing.
Not here on Solemnis, my lord,
smiled Sanet.
Forgive me, but yours is not the only collection in the galaxy.
Trazyn considered disassembling the cryptech for his impertinence, but if Sanet had felt able to interrupt him, what he had was clearly good. He nodded for the datamancer to continue, and when he heard what the being had to say, Trazyn smiled. It had, after all, been too long since his last visit. The Canoptic Spider's identification beam swept over Trazyn's death mask, reading the signature of his systemic aura. Satisfied, it bowed down in reverence and levitated backward and away, leaving the gateway clear.
Lord Trazyn,
it buzzed, crude vocals static-laced from eons of disuse.
Signal my network if you require assistance.
Obliged, said Trazyn, and strode through the graven doorway.
Before you access the vaults,
continued the spider,
I have been instructed to play you the following message.
A hatch in the floor opened to reveal an operculum. A broad-shouldered cryptech guttered into existence, the chrysoprase data partially corrupted, so his ghostly, blue-tinged form was missing pieces like an incomplete puzzle.
"Hail, Overlord Trazyn," said the image,
enormous metal beard waggling as it spoke.
I suspected you might pay us a visit during our slumber.
Transmogrify Horak, said Trazyn, though he knew the message could not answer. Leaving a welcome card. You sentimental thing.
It is beyond doubt that you are in your rights to be here. The Archivist of Nihilak, after all, maintains curatorial oversight of the dynasty's vault.
Nice of you to say.
But these are the vaults of the blessed Giden, not Solemnes. Examine and study what you will, but I have taken inventory of all collections and will notice any absences.
The nerve, said Trazyn, not in the least offended. He walked through the projection and continued into the chamber.
We remember well the incident on Thelamis,
continued Horak, speaking to nothing.
And charge you on your honour.
Yes, said Trazyn, leaving the scrambled messenger behind. Understood. What he was here for, mainly, could not be carried anyway. The Nihilak treasure houses consisted fully half of Geddon's subsurface structures. Vast and glittering, they spoke of a dynastic empire of breathtaking scope. As Trazyn walked the golden causeway, metal feet reverberating off the shining surface of the raised walkway, he passed doorways overflowing with fine objects and precious metals. The chambers within filled until they became impassable. Artifacts of long-dead civilizations stood heaped in piles, their surfaces dancing with the light of glittering gemstones carelessly tossed beside them. On his left, a full-size Necrontyr barge, fashioned from platinum, lay shipwrecked upon a pile of rubies, void silk sails hanging slack in the windless air. Trazyn hated the display. His fingers twitched with the urge to sort, catalogue and display each object in its proper context. But he knew that, despite appearances, Horak had already done so. This disorganized hoard was an act of feigned carelessness, a bit of theatre to overawe visitors with Nihilak extravagance and abundance. In truth, Horak had logged and recorded every coin, could probably even tell you if it was head or tail side up. After all, dynasties did not become wealthy by being careless with their treasure. Trazyn dimmed his oculars and walked on to the most exclusive vault in Geddon, the Chamber of the Seer. The great head floated in the centre of a spherical vault. Hoses trailed from the neck like dangling roots, pumping luminous magenta fluid in and out of the decapitated beast's severed neck. It was squat and reptilian, large as a temple, and was purported to be the last of its race, though what that race might be, Trazyn did not know. The greatest treasure of the Nihilak, the Yith-Seer. He entered it across the beast's tongue, approaching the resonance chamber built into its open mouth. As he crossed, Trazyn saw the great bulging eyes blink once. It came slow, like a cloud passing over the sun. Trazyn told himself it was not alive. Not really. The thought of it being otherwise was too disturbing. The horror of being kept in infinite undeath merely to fulfill a needed role. Trazyn banished that thought, it being too close for comfort. A circle of black stone chairs stood on the seer's mouth, in case the wash of visions made even the hardy bodies of the Necrons collapse. A living metal dome stretched above the chairs, forced against the seer's palate and keeping its jaws wide open. Trazyn sat and summoned a phosglyph panel, activating the neurographic resonators that shaped the seer's visions into holographic images.
Orokin will find the opening point of the Astrarium Mysterios. I need to know where and when that will happen.
Trazyn's sensor suite recorded a temperature drop. Feathery crystals of frost formed on the chill metal of his arms and hands. Around him, the huge mouth shifted, the living metal ceiling groaning in protest. In the center of the circle of chairs, nestled together like a campfire, the neurographic projectors glowed to life. Static electricity prickled Trazin's arms, snapping and popping as he moved his fingers to discharge it. Above the images, blurred images morphed and changed, came into being, then dissipated. Tropical canopy, coral atolls, a world of blue and green. He knew it, recognized it.
"Impossible,"
breathed Trazin. Trazin stopped at the artifact gallery on his way out. The object was right where Sanet had said it would be. The Time Splinter Cloak, forged from crystallized shards of time itself. An ancient chronomantic artifact that allowed the wearer to see the matrix of the future. Just the thing one needed to shape their destiny, or negate a particularly troublesome time sorcerer.
"I'm sure Transmogrifier Hurak would not mind my borrowing it for a spell," said Trazin. "He is, after all, not scheduled to wake for another 10,000 years.
But just in case, Trazin activated the security bypass talisman Sanet had provided.
"When I'm done," he promised himself, "I'll simply put it back. Hurak won't even notice it was gone."
Trazin left in a hurry. The security alarms were rather loud. Mandragora. Subcrypt 3,000 cubits below surface. Orokin checked his hermetic field for the 12th time, ran an operational diagnostic. It came back all clear, repelling both outside atoms and data transmissions, setting the chance of failure at less than 1 in 50 million. He looked at the abominable being before him, and knew that that was not good enough. He channeled more power into the field.
"And after the battle,"
the thing said, its voice chillingly unlike any Necron, growling, spitting, rusted.
"Our kind may do what we wish."
"You may," said Orokin. "I will not force you to return." Silence. A form moved in the shadow, circling to Orokin's right, the diviner's perception suite picking up the gleam of ocular light on bladed limbs. Orokin tried not to look at it, to keep his ocular focused on the twisted being that floated before him. Yet subroutine still tried to calculate whether the aberration on his flank intended to attack.
"It would be a great service to the dynasty," Orokin said.
"I care nothing for this dynasty,"
the thing said.
"But if you provide things, living things, biologicals for us to kill, we will come."
His objective achieved, Orokin retreated into the tomb's quarantine airlock and watched as the inner door closed and cycled, never taking his gaze off the monstrosities that lurked within. Chapter 6. Vashani. Tomorrow, my Pharaon, we join our armies in the dance of war. Nepereth.
"A true soldier does not merely step with his enemy, brilliant Vishani. He calls the dance and sets the beat, and tomorrow we shall strike up a rhythm such as the foe cannot resist."
Nepereth raises a command staff.
"Planetfall awaits, my subjects. Call captains, raise up banners, and put steel in your hearts."
War in Heaven. Act 14, Scene 2, lines 14 to 15. Green running lights hit the atmosphere, swallowed in the hazy yellow-white fire of planetary entry. Orokin felt his internals lurch, the build-up of superheated air molecules in front of the Ghost Ark slowing the craft from its void speed of 30,000 cubits per hour. He slowed his chronosense to watch the beauty of it. The Ghost Ark's ribbed crew bay stood open to the cold of space. Ice crystals colonizing the bodies of the immortals, ranked in 2 lines in front of him, evaporated as they slowed. Air molecules built up before the lead immortals, stealing the speed of the craft and converting the energy to heat. The very atmosphere flared into a glowing shroud around the front of the Ark, agitating until the molecules disassociated and became plasma, scorching the paint off the faces and bodies of those at the front. They stared forward, heedless of the inferno before and around them, did not even turn their heads as the incandescent air slipped past them in wave trails. Orokin watched with longing as the gauzy ribbons of air passed, reached out a hand to run his fingers through the glow. From matter to energy and back again, he thought. We should all be so fortunate one day. But for that to come to pass, he would need to make planetfall on this world and wipe out anything that stood between him and these coordinates. Establish a landing zone, secure the target, execute the ban, wipe out anything living. What lived on this planet now was unimportant, for though the savage Eldari Exodites might call it Sepharil, this was a Necron world, a frontier planet from the antique empire, hidden and remote, an ideal hiding place for the tomb complex known as Sephris, Stasis Mausoleum of Neperef the Untouched. There was no dolmen gate on Sepharil, no webway portal. It was cut off, remote, almost as if the Eldari did not want outsiders to discover it. After the birth of the transcendent hungering thing in the Immaterium, Orokin did not blame them. The flare of atmospheric entry died away, the cool blue of the planet's ocean contrasting with the sizzling orange of the Immortals. Their metal bodies heated as if emerging from a furnace. White clouds pinwheeled in storms and hung hazy over continents. As they bore in, Orokin saw the curvature of the planet slip past his peripheral vision, replaced by the iron-hot forms of more ghost arcs, pulling up in formation. "A pretty world," said Orokin, to no one in particular. "A shame what we're about to do to it."
"Reconfirm order,"
responded the Lord, helming the Ark, his confusion at Orokin's undirected statement clear from his voice.
"Is this a new directive?"
"Disregard. Take us down."
This, he thought, as the Ark went nose down,
is why I don't work with others.
Orokin had found most of his kind dull-witted and obnoxious, even in the flesh times, and that was before biotransference banished their souls and the Great Sleep scrambled their wits. With time dulling even the sharpest of minds, mere Ark helmsmen, despite being a subtype of Lord, were nearly intolerable. He checked his chronometer. 2 hours until the Mysterios was scheduled to open. Orokin had planned it that way. A sudden, deep strike. Make planetfall a month, a week, even a day in advance, and the Exodites might marshal enough resistance to make things difficult. After all, look at what had happened to Trazyn. True, the Exodites had received an anonymous warning from Orokin, but they had responded with speed. It did bother him, that fact. Out of the billion worlds in the Infinite Empire, the Mysterios had singled out the world of Sepharil, where Trazyn had pillaged a world spirit mere centuries before. The coincidence was so unlikely he'd run their astrolocation program 900 times to ensure he had not slipped a variable. After all, the map the Mysterios projected was not a modern one. 65 million years had passed since the time of Nepereth. The war in heaven and reign of the Eldari had reshaped the cosmos in ways small and large. Indeed, even the humans' recent civil war had destroyed and reshaped planets. Yet, Orokin had cross-referenced the ancient star map with a modernized one. He'd enlarged the target planet and ran simulations on continental drift, sliding landmasses, until they formed their current shape. Near 100% match. Chance of identification error sat at less than 0.00003%. Sepharis was Sepharil. Ghost arcs pulled out of their dive, gravitational forces dragging at the craft so hard the metal of their ribs groaned. They levelled out and tore 15 cubits over the surface of the ocean, repulsor systems carving wakes in the sapphire water. To his right One of the arcs slapped through the crest of a wave, drenching the occupants with spray that sizzled on their still hot metal skin. A mass of clouds appeared on the horizon, growing steadily larger as the arc fleet barreled towards it. As they closed, Orokin could see the shadowy reflection of land on the underside of the cloud cap. Below, a line of green resolved itself on the horizon. An island. Orokin summoned a Phosglyph chart and checked their heading. This was it, the archipelago. 7,000 small to mid-size islands and atolls, dotting the hemispheric ocean. Trazyn had only visited the largest, the continent-sized mass that served as the Exodite's planetary capital. Orokin tried to rationalize that. Perhaps it was Trazyn's return from Sephiroth that helped activate the Mysterios when it sent some organic matter hitchhiking on his frame. Or maybe the gem he brought back, so tied with the world itself, had briefly interfered with the gravitational signature of the room. None of that made sense, though, and Orokin knew it. As a seer, he knew there were no coincidences, only confluences. Time was a river, one that swept along even the most powerful. Eons of study let him briefly paddle against the current, but eventually even he must surrender to the pull of fate. Orokin hated few things more than wasting energy, and to question fate was the most inefficient use of energy he could imagine. Trees and white beaches, and a line of structures poking through the tropical canopy. Trails of white birds, strung out from shore like fluttering banners.
"Count 30 to contact,"
buzzed the helmsman from his womb cockpit, fingers sliding over the control orb.
"Incoming!"
A stream of objects whipped past the arc, singing through the air as they passed. For a nanosecond, Orokin thought they'd driven through a flock of birds, but then he saw the blinking from the shoreline and the dazzling streak of a prism beam. The arc to his left rattled and dipped its nose a moment, shuriken the size of dinner plates embedded in its prow struts. Something went spinning towards him and bounced off the hull of Orokin's craft, and he slowed his chronosense to see it was a Necron's head, taken clean off by the wicked discs. On the damaged arc, its headless body still stood hunched, bladed arms obediently crossed over its chest in transport position. A pulse laser streaked by, boiling a hole through the rolling surf. "Take us under," Orokin ordered. His arc went nose down, ramming like a diver into the crystal water. Bubbles fouled his vision before whirling away to stern. Schools of iridescent fish panicked and scattered. Orokin looked left and right, seeing the arcs plough through the inshore waters, driving a school of yellow porpoises before them. Keels scraped the pastel reef, snapping lattice fans and shattering branches of red coral. On the surface, shuriken skipped like rocks, pattering concentric circles of ripples on the water above them. Lasers hit the water and refracted, dissipating their power into starbursts of green that left even the fish unharmed. A prism blast carved a channel in the water, but it could not depress far enough to hit the submerged arcs. They cleared the reef, entered the bay, saw the sandy bottom rising up underneath them like a ramp. "Come up firing," signaled Orokin. "Artillery first!" Behind him, two dark shapes broke off, rising towards the surface like cetaceans coming up to breathe. A moment later, a pair of thick red cylinders flashed overhead, carving twin furrows in the water's surface and briefly painting the aquatic world pink. Detonations reverberated through the water in a slapping jolt, and above him a wave swept back the wrong way. The Doomsday arcs had engaged. "Surface!" he crowed. His arc soared upward, the tension of the water stressing his footlocks. They smashed through the glassy surface and into a world of light, sound, and fire. On the shore, a bone redoubt was burned black, its prism cannon cast aside by the explosion and half buried in sand. Trees along the shore were afire, their canopies curling and dropping away. Among those branches, Orokin could see the charred forms of Eldari's sharpshooters, Wraithbone rifles fused into clawed hands.
"Clearing the deck,"
the helmsman said, wryly.
"as they say."
The Ark shuddered with gathering power, and broadside flare arrays unleashed ancient fury. Eldari troops surging onto the shore from the tree line wailed as green lightning stripped them to marrow. Along the beach, a bright lance speared into a ghost ark, cooking off its power plant. Necrons, still rigid in the transport position, sailed from it like enormous hunks of shrapnel. They ploughed into sand and splashed down in the water. Then were on their feet, pressing the attack. Necrons. Did these corrupted things even deserve the name? They scuttled forward, bladed tripod legs digging in the sand for purchase. Arms that once held command staffs and Gauss blasters were now given over to implanted blades. On one, Orokin swore he saw the defaced cartouche of a royal warden. Once they had been nobility, soldiers, guardians of empire. Now they were destroyers, fallen to the madness that drove them to hate all living things. Bodies augmented with chopping blades and double-handed glaives, every angle of their bodies sharp. The Skorpek subtype, obsessed with the whirl of the melee. They rushed into the Eldari on the shore, wheeling and striking, bodies falling before them. A group of Raptor Knights burst from the tree line and crashed into the combat, one spearing a Skorpek through the thorax with his wraithbone lance. The Skorpek squealed in fury and climbed up the lance, shoving the impaling weapon deeper into its own body so the long cleaver blades of its arms could butcher both rider and mount. Then it chopped the lance away and continued into the trees. Orokin dismounted, hitting the sound with a whir of compensating servos that took the impact without a single bended joint. With a conjurer's sweep of the hand, the Staff of Tomorrow translated from the ether. A tribal warrior in a feather cloak wheeled on him, pirouetting in a leap, firing her shuriken pistol with one leg thrown out in a gymnastic leap. Orokin calculated trajectories and stepped between the incoming missiles. With a thought, he grasped control of a Gauss flare from the Ark and repurposed it to strip the warrior to the bone. She'd left the earth a dancer, as graceful as one of the multicolored birds whose plumage bristled her feather cloak. But she returned to the sand as nothing but a stripped carcass. His divination matrix warned him of a threat from his blind side, and he swept the staff around, splitting a bone sword in two and blasting its wielder backward into the surf with a discharge of arc lightning. The body convulsed, drowning, until the waves rolled it lifeless back to shore. By that time, he was halfway to the tree line. Killing the Eldari felt good, natural. Immortal foes struggling once more. They were both eternal and perfect, in their own way. But while the Necrons were beings forged, the flawless features of the Eldari, no less mask-like than Orokin's own, remained flesh and blood. But they were still things created, built and designed by the Old Ones, as much as the Necrons were works of the Catan. Confluence, Orokin reflected, not coincidence. The cosmos is a constructed place. But he could not become lost in these reveries. Only 16 minutes left.
This resistance is concerning,
Orokin thought, as a doomsday arc blasted another tunnel of gore and fire through the enemy ranks.
Did their own astromancers, whatever they were called, see it coming?
16 minutes to get a mile inland. Orokin could feel the Mysterios sitting heavy in his dimensional pocket, impossible as that was. A fresh cabal of Eldari warriors charged him, wheeling and dancing. Barbed double-sided spears flashed past, scratching his metal carapace. One found the gaps in his lower thorax armor and sank deep into his cabling. He formed his hand into the sigil of Wemby, summoning a chrono-accelerated aura of radiation from his central reactor. The warriors dropped their spears from weakened fingers and fell wailing to the root-tangled sand, rashes breaking out on their tattooed skin and teeth, dropping from receding gums.
I have no time for this,
Orokin sneered. He dislodged the spear from his system guts and tossed it aside, still walking. 14 minutes. He signalled the 2 arcs of immortals, their warriors already dismounting into combat.
"Override! Take me inland," he ordered. "Keep 4 immortals as honor guard."
Signals crossed in the confusion of battle, 2 arcs responding. One nosed the other way and swept up beside him. He leapt onto the arc as it passed, maglocking his hand to the skin of the skimmer as it hovered by.
"Welcome aboard, Master Orican,"
said the addled helmsman.
"Are these the new orders?"
Orican swore. The interior of the island was in chaos. Orican had needed an army, but one that would not be missed. Not an easy task. Remove too many warriors from the vaults of Mandragora, and he'd risk having to answer questions once the dynasty arose. It might have also tipped his hand to the awakened council, which no doubt would be keeping tabs on his movements. He could get away with raising 2 phalanxes of immortals and a few arcs, but that was nowhere near enough for this operation, which is why he'd brought in the destroyers, the Mad Ones, a strike force that would not be missed. A group kept in quarantine and culled at regular intervals, so their taint would not spread. Indeed, he would have to destroy every arc used to transport the killers to ensure their data had not infected the craft. The Skorpek destroyers had hit the beach along with the immortals, but the heavy destroyers, the ones who had modified themselves into floating weapons platforms, had slammed down straight through the jungle canopy. Their purpose was to disrupt the Eldari response, to sow chaos and prevent forces massing into coordinated units. And the destroyers were doing that work well, drawing enemy reinforcements to engage them, rather than reinforce the battle line. Their mad and seemingly randomized orgy of devastation created gaps in the Eldari ranks, as they dragged forces to them like iron filings to a magnet. Orican could not see the destroyer complement, but he could see their effect. A searing line of Gauss energy sliced through the rainforest ahead of them, felling a tree as neatly as any saw. Through the foliage, he could see the lumbering forms of great lizards headed towards the chaos. The biodiversity of this world was rich. His ocular analytics tagged new species and novel subtypes wherever he looked. Deep in his central reactor, Orican hoped the destroyers would be wiped out before they could do irreparable damage. Left with no enemy to fight, they would scour this island of life, systemically eradicating first the animals, then the largest trees, and even the microbes. They would not rest until every living organism, from the hanging vines to the insects living on pond surfaces and the seaweed clinging to rocks, was dead. Then they would move on to the next island. Orican shivered, but he had only 10 minutes left, and for now the destroyers were serving their purpose. A foot, larger than any Orican had ever seen, slammed down in front of the ark as they swept around a mountain ridge. Trees collapsed around it, and Orican leaned back to see an enormous brachiosaur, tall as a pyramidal stasis tomb, looming above. On its back sat a mobile battle fortress, sculpted from bone, bristling with artillery. The beast's next titanic step swung like a pendulum towards the ark, fated to crush the skeletal craft and throw its crew asunder. He could see the dappled skin incoming, the way jungle parasites had burrowed into the thick leather and made themselves a colony in its scaled flesh. Orican centered his mind. He threw his consciousness backward 10 seconds, instructed the helmsman to bank left, and the ark weaved between the beast's colossal legs, its shadow flickering over them. They swept upward, riding air currents as the trade winds careened against the mountains and surged towards the sky. Dark metal howling past dark rock, a shadow casting a shadow. Orican watched it pass over the rock and dapple over the shrubs that clung to the surface. This place seemed like paradise, but it was like any other, full of dogged desperation. This range, its green ridges and deep valleys that ran 14 leagues along the island's crooked spine, was the work of erosion. It appeared as if a giant had formed the range out of clay, then run his fingers through it, gouging out vast furrows. But this was not so. These great mountains were the work of time and cruel geology, mounded high by a volcanic hotspot that had created the archipelago, then abandoned as the tectonic plate carried the magma eruption further northwest to make new islands. This one had been left to weather through millions of years of wind and rain, moulding its high fastness, eroding its proud slopes speck by speck. The lively white streams of the waterfalls, nestled in the back of each valley, picturesque though they were engaged in an eons-long act of violence. Indeed, Orokin detected a nagging worry in the back of his neural matrix. What was the Mysterios leading him to? If it was a landmark, some temple or pylon, it was entirely possible the structure was gone. The mountain may have retreated beneath it, leaving it loose in its foundations like the teeth of the rat-poisoned Eldari. Perhaps it lay, dislodged and fallen, at the bottom of one of the valleys, buried by volcanic eruption. 65 million years was a long time, even to a Necron's reckoning. No, it was location-based, not keyed to a building. Orokin was sure of it. 8 minutes until opening. Orokin's perception suite painted warnings across his vision. He wheeled, saw spots in the sun. Recalibrating his ocular to filter out the tropical shrine, he saw pterosaur riders diving down at him out of the sky. The beasts had their leathery wings back, long heads extended. Their riders lay flat against the dinosaurs, hands twisted in hemp reins and shuriken pistols sprouting from their scrim-shawed vambraces.
"Pterosaur riders!"
warned one of the immortals. Once again, Orokin felt keenly the irritation of being 3 steps ahead of his fellows. So much repetition.
"Incoming pterosaurs!"
added the curdle-brained helmsman, powering up the Ark's flare array. A step behind, Orokin noted, as usual. Disassembling beams tore the air, their fountains of lightning almost clear in the island sunlight. The Immortals closed formation, short, disciplined blasts creating a coordinated wall of fire that would catch the riders wherever they wheeled and dived. Double-barreled Gauss blasters shrieked, their tubes dripping condensation as the cold of the gases inside drew water from the humid air.
"Le counter-evasive fire,"
said the lead Immortal.
"Choose quadrant."
An Eldari warrior dropped from the air, screaming, his pterosaur blown to ash beneath him. He clawed at empty space with his remaining arm as he fell. 2 broke off, backing air with their wings and swooping behind one of the ridges to shelter in a deep valley. Another rider wheeled and rolled, diving under the fusillade. The Ark's flare array howled, but while the Immortals sketched a careful matrix of anti-air fire, the helmsman let loose with an almost gleeful relish, sweeping them back and forth like streams of water from a decorative fountain. Disassembling beams arced and corkscrewed, chasing the diving rider across the sky, following his loops and rolls. The rider swept in, its shadow painted Orokin. He could see the beast's claws open, ready to pluck him into the sky like a rodent, felt the wash of its leathery wings. They were much bigger up close. The flare array snapped to, and the pterosaur dissolved in air. Its feathery ashes washed over the diviner.
"Apologies,"
said the helmsman, chuckling.
"That one got close, didn't he?"
Orokin turned to reprimand the absurd lord when his triangulation signifier pinged.
"We've arrived on target,"
said the helmsman, his mission programming reasserting itself and driving his voice flat. And Orokin made the deliberate programming decision to forget the obnoxious pilot. Focus on the task at hand. "Helmsman, key auto-suspension and slumber your neural matrix."
"Confirm,"
the pilot said, head sinking to his chest. Once this place might have been a gentle slope, a ridge supporting a mountain fastness or celestial observatory. Now It was empty air and sheer rock wall, a slope that must be climbed rather than walked. No matter.
"Secure perimeter," he snapped, drawing out the Mysterios. The Immortals mag-locked their Gauss blasters to their backs and leapt onto the rock face, clawed hands and feet digging deep into the volcanic stone. They spread out, spider-like, hacking down foliage with their axe bayonets to clear fields of fire and spooling utility cables out from their internals to anchor themselves to the cliff. Orokin twisted his fingers together, touched his fingers to palm, and made Salvar's dual invocation. With fierce concentration, he sketched out a circle in the air, drew down the energy of the shining stars, and cast a protective ward around himself, a half-bubble that enclosed the arc he floated on and sealed it against the mountain face, shutting out even the Immortals that guarded him. The outside world faded. All that stood outside the circle were mere outlines, like in the old shadow puppet plays the Silent King used to commission for palace children. Perfect quiet. No breeze stirred the plants clinging to the rock. The helmsman, inert, made no move. They would not be disturbed. 1 minute until the Mysterios opened. He had done it. Orokin drew the Mysterios out from his dimensional pocket. He could feel its hum, matching the song sung by the planet itself. Ever since he'd landed, he could sense it. The rhythm of this place. A thrumming sense of belonging. This was a Necron world. He could feel it deep in his systems. Confluence. Elements where they were supposed to be.
"What are your secrets, little one?"
Orokin asked. The Mysterios tugged at his hand like a bird wanting to take off. He let it go. It rose in the air. Glyphs burning pink. Angles shifted. Faces folded in on themselves and turned inside out. Pink light shifted to amber, spilling out so bright it painted the inner ribs of the Ghost Ark in its radiance. What happened next, Orokin could not see, because the shifting puzzle box became so hot and iridescent that it briefly overwhelmed his ocular, blanking it out to white. That light, he realized, might have killed a being from one of the lesser races. Only a Necron would have been able to withstand the deadliness of its shining rays. The same excruciating solar bombardment, he realized, of their home world. The beautiful burn of the Necrontier's sun that had cursed his kind to an eternity of cancerous growth and shortened lives, a legacy that followed them even after they fled its poison light. Orokin felt a catch in his systems. Had he the capacity to weep, he might have done so in that blinded state. This object was ancient and deadly, a piece of the time before. He felt unworthy even to touch it. Sacredness poured from its every fractured angle. Gradually, his ocular came back online. The Astrarium Mysterios had changed. His geomantic analyzers counted 12 faces, 20 vertices, 30 edges. A dodecahedron, perfectly balanced, mathematically exact down to the molecular level. Blue glyphs, their aquamarine the same color as the planet's oceans, blinked as if making some sort of calculation. Then the Mysterios projected a chrysoprase hologram. A spectral image of Sephiroth ballooned around the Mysterios, the whole globe rotating along with the Astrarium as if the device were its molten core. Orokin could see the planet's oceans, the continents drifting and realigning as the Mysterios recalibrated its maps to compensate for 65 million years of continental drift. Continents tore apart and collided. Islands erupted and eroded into atolls. And on one of those islands, the largest, the continent island, flared a glyph. Orokin gasped.
"Yes, yes!"
A glyph reading Tomb and Nepereth.
"I've beaten you, Vishani,"
he crowed.
Orokin, Chronomancer Supreme, greatest of cryptics, decoder of the Vishanic manuscripts. I have solved your riddles and unraveled your code. Only I have done this.
The glyph changed. It displayed a date. A date over 8,000 years from the current one.
What?
Orokin's beatific tone fell.
Another layer? Another chase? 8,000 years of waiting?
How disappointing, said Trazyn. It had been great fun, needling the diviner, acting the addled pilot. Blasting the Ark's flare array had been particularly entertaining. He really had to get out more, he decided. He'd been in the galleries too long.
How?
Mandragora has superb defences, said Trazyn. But where there is a will, you know, and I have will to spare.
In addition to will, Trazyn had an infection algorithm that could, properly inserted, lay the groundwork to make almost any Necron a temporary surrogate. Well, not any Necron. An unprepared overlord, certainly. One who had lapsed in their security protocols. Cryptex were often out of reach due to their technomantic defences. But a mere Arc-helmsman? Almost too easy. Especially with the Yithsir revealing where and when to intercept Orokin's strike force. And, of course, the cloak. He could feel it heating, detecting a chrono-jump in process. A possibility matrix flashed across his neural network, just as Orokin's time totems began to heat, and Trazyn picked the future that interrupted the hex. He rolled his hand over the control orb, rolling the Arc 90 degrees so its belly faced the mountainside. Orokin dropped, feet skidding along the deck, chronotrance broken. The diviner grabbed for the hovering Mysterios as he plunged, missed it, and clanged hard off one of the ribbed struts of the Arc. He began sliding into space and clawed for purchase, feet dangling thousands of cubits above the valley floor.
No, I think not, my dear colleague, said Trazyn, nestled secure in the womb cockpit. I'm afraid your little timeline misadventures will no longer be a part of our rivalry.
Orokin got purchase, maglocked. He began to rise to a crouch. Trazyn slewed the Arc back and forth, shaking him like a feline shakes a rodent. Orokin scrambled, barely keeping his grip.
You may have abilities,
continued Trazyn, inching the Arc forward and seizing the Mysterios. But I have artifacts. Doubtless this cloak's powers are a poor echo of what you've achieved through years of study, but it can at least countermand your chrono-sorcery. Bad form, by the way. Cheating at the trial. Extraordinarily imaginative, but bad form.
If you think I need to alter the timeline to destroy you, Trazyn,
Orokin scrambled to his feet, crouching.
Then you're more delusional than I thought. I have glimpsed a future that is unkind for you.
Orokin swept a hand across the sky, and the dome field disappeared. 4 immortals looked at Trazyn, their heads rotating nearly front to back.
Incinerate,
said Orokin. Trazyn slammed the acceleration glyph. The Ark's keel ploughed into the mountainside, grinding an immortal to scraps between the living metal hull and the jagged lava rock. The other 3 clambered aboard, Gauss blasters locked to their backs, using all their strength to haul themselves up the hurtling ghost arc towards Trazyn. The Time Splinter cloak's matrix trilled a warning, and Trazyn ducked hard to one side, sliding his fingers along the control orb in a roll. The world spun, mountain and sky, ground and sea. A bolt of etheric energy streaked by his shoulder, blasting a head-sized chunk of living metal from the Ark's curved stern vein. He glanced above the console to see Orokin struggling to maintain his grip, one hand still crackling with electricity. Trazyn pulled the Arc out of the spin, rolling back on the control orb to keep them from diving into the ground. The keel slapped a treetop, exploding it into a cloud of organic debris. Matrix warnings blared. Trazin cleared them so he could see. An immortal gained his feet, mag-locked and steady. He froze his actuators to maintain a firing position and raised his Gauss blaster. The cloak's matrix calculated interrupt possibilities. 0. Trazin could do nothing. The Gauss emitters on the blaster looked very big when you were staring right into them, Trazin thought. The pterosaur hit the immortal like a meteor, its beak snapping at abdominal cables, claws rending the soldier's living metal. Actuators burst in miniature electrical storms as the beast ripped limbs out of joint. It must have been one of the two that broke off, Trazin realized. They'd lurked on the valley ridges until their prey was most vulnerable. The rider, wild-haired with a network of geometric facial tattoos, circles and lines connecting, unloaded an entire shuriken magazine into a second immortal. Monofilament discs butchered the soldier, disconnected pieces and gouged systems crackling with emerald lightning. Next to him, Orokin threw up a kinetic shield to halt the incoming storm of shots. Reactor fluid from the slain immortal spattered his death mask. Wrenching the mauled immortal free, the pterosaur rider took off into the sky, gone in an instant. Trazin slewed the arc around the mountains, heading away from Orokin's beachhead. With only one immortal left aboard, and the diviner, the last thing he needed was to drive himself into another sea of troops. To his right, he could see a dazzling array of disassembling beams tearing through the forest, dancing in the sky. It appeared they were clear-cutting the forest, burning an ever-expanding wound into the island's foliage. He'd looked too long. Orokin leapt over the command console, wrestling for the control orb. The arc skidded in air, reversing in a wide arc.
"You brought the tainted here!"
Trazin shouted. They were moving so fast it was hard to hear. The wind stole his words as soon as they left his mouth. He grabbed Orokin's shoulder guard and slammed their heads together in a headbutt that sounded like hammer on anvil.
"Destroyers will scour this place clean! All this unique wildlife, plant species!"
Orokin summoned the Staff of Tomorrow and chopped down, but wrestling close as they were, the console between them and the wind tearing at the craft, the blow lacked force and speed. Trazin caught the haft, its field-enveloped headpiece digging only a finger's breadth into his armoured hood.
"It was their price,"
said Orokin, reaching for the actuator that opened Trazin's dimensional pocket.
"This is not their world anyway. It belongs to the Infinite Empire."
Trazin saw the immortal levelling his weapon and spun, throwing Orokin between himself and the shot. Gauss tubes howled. Green beams danced above their heads. Orokin shrieked, and something in him exploded. The immortal's command protocols had warned him to pull the shot at the last minute, but too late. He'd merely glanced Orokin, rather than hold him. The diviner's back carapace smouldered. An ashy trench burned through the blue armour. One of the orbs on his chest lay shattered and broken, leaking vapour that scrambled Trazin's oculars when he looked at it.
"Incompetent!"
Orokin threw a hand back, and an arc of energy bisected the soldier diagonally. The wind took his top half, and it sailed rearward into the jungle canopy. Trazin was celebrating when he saw the second immortal, the one chopped to pieces by the shuriken pistol, reassembling. That was the purpose of a ghost arc, after all, to rebuild troops rendered inoperable on the battlefield. Even as he watched, he could see the blue molecular assembly beams spearing out from the top of the arc's ribs, fusing metal and rebuilding layer by layer. A Gauss flare in reverse. The immortal raised his weapon. Orokin grabbed Trazin's head, and he saw something in the diviner's eyes flare. A white chemical fire. A light. His image seemed to judder and blink. Trazin swore there were two of the diviner for a moment, as if the astromancer were projecting a hologram. His oculars scrawled through filters, trying to identify what was happening. They landed on one meant for checking power systems. Orokin burned with energy. No, Orokin was energy. His body shone, incandescent, transmuted to an astral form of pure blazing power that was battling to take hold over his necrodermis, to turn his very atoms into pure energy. Heat flares twisted off him like an aura. "Nepareth!" shouted Orokin. His mouth spewed gusts of solar wind as he spoke.
"The secret is here, on this world. It sings with it."
Trazyn could not fight this strength. Orokin's astral hands forced his head to the side, bending him over at the hip, pinning his head to the command console well clear of his body. He felt that Orokin might crush him. Heat began cooking his neurals.
"The head!"
Orokin ordered the immortal.
"Take your time."
The Gauss blaster raised. Trazyn stretched, reaching out, rebuilding his body to elongate his arm and fingers only an inch more. His vision was failing, his ocular lenses beginning to bubble.
"I did not foresee this future, Trazyn," the diviner said, "but it pleases me."
Trazyn brushed his fingers on the command orb and smiled. Orokin saw the expression, followed Trazyn's hand to the command orb, looked behind him. The great saurian loomed like a building, Fortress Howder towering above them, legs thick as temple columns beneath. Its great long neck twisted around, confused at the oncoming object. Trazyn disconnected the helmsman's cable, disengaged his maglocks, and let the wind fling him astern. The ghost arc hit the saurian at 400 cubits per hour, ramming right through the thick cage of bone armor and punching through its ribs. Flesh rippled from the impact, and Eldari tumbled from its back. A great creature, the largest of its kind, venerated and feared. It died instantaneously. Heart ruptured. The great temple column legs went loose, and it toppled sideways from the kinetic force of the hit, splintering trees and clearing a hole in the forest with its fall. One titanic leg kicked in a death spasm and demolished a stone temple, an incident the Eldari would take as an even worse omen than the great creature's death. Across the island, scavengers would scent the enormous quantity of blood on the wind and embark on carrion migrations to take advantage of the windfall. Whole colonies of carnivorous mosses would colonize the body of the great saurian, and the lizards that ate those mosses, and the hook-beaked birds that ate the lizards, would form their own societies there, until the body was nothing but unusable bone. Civilizations, after all, always build on the dead. Orokin foresaw this, and cared nothing for it, as he crawled from the beast's ruptured chest cavity. Covered in gore, injuries sparking, he turned his mangled head towards the sky. Trazyn was out there, no doubt. His escape already made good. But that didn't matter. For Orokin had unlocked a great secret within himself. Orokin had transmuted to an energy form before. Indeed, it was a well-known practice for the Plasmancer Order. One able to take on the energy form could walk through closed gates and overload machinery. Channeling ambient power sources into their metal form, they could become nigh invulnerable for minutes at a time. Some drew that power from solar radiation or by tapping external reactor cores. Orokin, his gaze always upon the stars, drew on the directed energy of planetary alignments. But this had been greater than that. He had sensed so much power surging past him, bombarding him, that his unprepared mind and body could only channel a small part. Had he tried, it would have torn him apart at the molecular level. Yet he had captured more than he'd expected. All his reading and studying, the esoteric texts and theoretical works, the very words of Vishani, had imparted a gift without his knowledge. Whether by stars or planets, geography or arcane wisdom, Orokin had briefly become transmuted, like the Mysterios, ethereal and empowered, like the fabled Nepereth. He had become transcendent, one of the gods, like the Catan. Orokin reached inside himself, finding the wet warmth of his reactor leak. The glowing jade fluid coated his hand, and he used it to paint a sigil on his forehead crest. And he made an ancient oath, one from a long-ago home world where his kind had been flesh, not metal. Back in those centuries, the oath would have been taken with blood, but now he took it with a substance more deadly and enduring.
"I swear,"
he said, his vocal actuators grinding,
"by the killing sun, by the stars and dust, by my ancestors and the progeny, I swear to harness these powers and open the tomb of Nepereth."
The sky was growing dark. He could see the stars.
"But first,"
said Orokin,
"I swear to destroy Trasin the Infinite."